G'day, mate. 40 here. So there's a great line in the TV series Yellowstone. I think it's in the first episode where this old Indian says to the white guy, until they find a cure for human nature, a man belongs with his own kind. And so most people are better off with their own kind. Now, what their kind is, for some people, will be primarily their profession. Right? Most people will be better off with their own kind. So for some people, it means if you're a surgeon, hanging out with other surgeons. If you're an attorney, having a community with other attorneys. If you're a journalist, having a community with other journalists. If you're a professor, maybe your own kind for your fellow academics. For many people, their own kind will be racial, right? They feel most comfortable around people like themselves, most comfortable around their fellow Poles or their fellow Jews or their fellow West Africans or their fellow Caribbean descendants. And so I was watching the new documentary Yacht Rock yesterday, and I hadn't heard of the term Yacht Rock until recently. So this documentary is about the rise of the smooth West Coast sound pioneered by artists like Steely Dan, Toto, and Michael McDonald. And Yacht Rock goes from about 1978 until about 1984. One thing that struck me in this documentary is that none of the white guys who are interviewed, most of the people who are interviewed on this documentary are white guys. The people who directed it and produced it, overwhelmingly white guys. The protagonists in this documentary are overwhelmingly white guys, and none of them display the slightest white in-group identity. They show no preference for anything white. On the other hand, there are quite a few black commentators on the documentary for whom their fellow blacks and black welfare and black interests and black self-esteem is like vitally important. And so you have this one guy who's quite blackety black, and he takes offense at the song by Toto, Africa, which was their only #1 hit. He takes great offense. And so I don't disparage people whose primary identity is racial, right? I don't disparage people whose primary identity is religious or ethnic or professional or geographic. Most people will be better off with a strong in-group identity. Whether your in-group identity is that of journalist or surgeon or accountant or as black or gay or Jewish or Christian. But with any kind of strong in-group identity, there will be resentment against outgroups. And so you see this historian of music, this black guy is a historian, and he takes great offense to Toto singing a song about Africa. Now, nobody would take offense at black people excelling in some area of culture that has been developed by non-blacks. But because I presume he has a strong in-group black identity, he takes great exception to a white group singing about Africa. And it's particularly insulting because nobody in that group had ever been there. Right, main topic for today. And you often hear from the more sophisticated and attention-getting political pundits that there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats. Right? That's largely been Richard Spencer's view or Nick Fuentes' view. Neither one of these widely covered pundits was making the case for Donald Trump this season. Richard Spencer has largely thrown in his lot with the Democrats over the past 4 years. But there is an incredibly dramatic difference between left and right, Republicans and Democrats. And that is, while the left celebrates and fawns over criminals like this Luigi Mangione guy, overwhelmingly, right, people on the right want to punish them. Right? Overwhelmingly, people on the right want to have capital punishment for people who commit wanton murders like this guy Luigi Mangione. And to me, this is a huge difference. Right. And it is an objective, unassailable difference between left and right. And that is the right wants to punish norm violators. The right is invested in punishing people who do horrible violations of the legal code and the moral code and wreak havoc against other people. And that is uniformly a right-wing reaction. That is just objectively true. People on the right are for punishment, and all punishment contains an element of vengeance. The vengeance isn't a dirty word from the perspective of the right. And people on the left are all about the healing. They're not about the punishment. They're all about transcending the desire to punish. They regard it as criminal. They regard it as primitive. All punishment contains, they think that it shows that you're quite inadequate as a developed human, that you haven't outgrown these primitive desires for vengeance. And so the left is all about minimizing punishment, maximizing nurturing for people who do horrible things, like Luigi Mangione. And on the right, we want to punish murderers. Generally speaking, in the United States, if you're on the right, it means you want capital punishment for murder. And so all the public figures who are expressing a great deal of empathy for the murderer of the healthcare CEO, right, they're on the left. And this is part of a long pattern, and it's such a vitally important difference, right? The left wants to celebrate or fawn over or nurture or take care of people who do horrible things, while on the right, the reaction is overwhelmingly, we want to punish. All right, I'm all for law and order. So those people on January 6th who beat police officers, I want them punished. Now, those who just strolled into the Capitol building, did no harm to anyone, did no harm to property, did no harm to people, all right, then it should be a misdemeanor. But for people on the right who beat police officers, and people on the left and people in the center who beat police officers, I want them severely punished. People who commit murder, like Luigi Mangione, I want him executed. And this is a typical reaction on the right. Right? The right traditionally wants to punish people who violate our moral norms. And people on the left want to tone down the punishment, tone down the vengeance, and rehabilitate. And so for anyone who says, no important difference between Democrats and Republicans, there's a life and death difference. Republicans are far more supportive of lengthy prison terms and capital punishment and severe punishment for people who do bad, and for creating a political and legal and social welfare system that incentivizes those people to do incentivizes all people to do the right things, to work hard, to be responsible, and on the contrary, for people who act in an antisocial manner, you want to have disincentives in place to punish people for making the world around them a worse place. So you have vast groups who primarily take out vast sums in social welfare spending and contribute comparatively little in taxes, while most people who watch and listen to this show, they pay far more in taxes than they ever take out in social welfare spending. Another interesting question with regard to Luigi Mangione is that he seems to have been partly inspired by the Unabomber. And I'm pretty close to a free speech absolutist. I see no problem with reading and discussing the Unabomber's thesis, that you can recognize that there are good points and profound points in the Unabomber's thesis without supporting murder. So I hold Luigi Mangione responsible for what I did. I don't hold the Unabomber. I recognize in the most stigmatized literature, from the Unabomber to Mein Kampf, that you can better understand why people act the way they do, and better understand how the world turned out as it did by reading disturbing literature. And this is not going to predispose people towards going out and committing murder. Right? The link between reading violent materials and hateful materials and murder is infinitesimal. Right? There are all sorts of bloodthirsty passages in the Bible, and only on a tiny number of occasions does somebody read them and then go out and commit murder, claiming they were inspired by the Bible. All right, this is John Podhoretz.
This is a very important dividing line in modern American political history. And like many bad things, we can date it back to the 1960s. But I would date it back, in my own reckoning, to the Watts riots in LA in 1965. So I'm not going to go through the history of the Watts riots in but that was the first real urban action in which people in a city and neighborhood.
So I remember I graduated high school in 1984. I went back to Australia for a year, and I was talking about how terrible it was that Australia used to have a white Australia policy, that it wanted to preserve a homogeneous country. And the response that I would get back is, well, look at all the riots that the United States has suffered, riots largely driven by its significantly African population, from Watts to the LA riots to riots all over the country. And the kind of racial diversity that the United States has does come with some very significant downsides, right? You almost never have to think about your personal safety in Australia, while you have to take it into account on a frequent basis in most American big cities.
It sort of like took to the streets violently to complain about social policy and street removal and cops misbehaving and all of that. And from the Watts riots onward through the riots that greeted the assassination of Martin Luther King, that saw 10 cities.
So yes, a naive 18-year-old Luke Ford just graduated from high school, comes back to Australia and is saying wonderful things about how great the United States is with its multiracial democracy. But I didn't have any answers when people pushed back and pointed out the significant challenges and problems and the huge prices paid for the diversity. In essence, that the less we have in common with each other, the less likely we are to get along and to sacrifice for each other, and the less comfortable we will be in each other's presence.
In the United States have vast swaths of minority neighborhoods pretty much destroyed in rioting over those 3 days. The release of the Kerner Commission report in 1968 about the inequalities between Black life and white life in the United States and others, that the idea that giant criminal social action arises from an understandable root that we need to understand, sympathize with, and take action to solve, so that the people who did it are satisfied that there is change that can belay their impulse toward murder, is one of the 2 or 3 bright dividing lines between left and right in the United States over the last 60 years. And I don't say that hyperbolically. There were 2 elements of the crime surge that started in 1963. One of them was various forms of social change.
So a huge difference between people on the right and people on the left is that people on the right overwhelmingly believe that you are responsible for the criminal violence that you commit, while people on the left overwhelmingly believe that you are not responsible for the criminal violence that you commit, that society is primarily responsible.
Including changes in the way people thought cops should interact with the public, and exposures of, corruption in police departments that meant that cops were suddenly in bad odor with a lot of people. They should stay in cars and not try to prevent crimes, but respond to crimes after they've been committed. And a general view in liberal jurisprudence that we needed to focus on the reasons that people became criminals in the first place, and what could we do either to prevent that or to rehabilitate them, to clean, to make prisons better places, to make rehabilitation more and more sort of like an option and something that could really work to help us in a progressive way make America better. And that it became very clear very early on that we had an entire...
I can't think of anyone prominent on the right who is expressing a great deal of sympathy for Luigi Mangione. It seems to me every public figure who's expressing a great deal of sympathy for Luigi Mangione is on the left. And I can't think of any prominent members of the Democratic Party who are for capital punishment, while by and large, most Republicans are staunchly behind capital punishment for murderers.
Side of the American ideological political conversation that was siding with the criminals over the ordinary people whom they were terrorizing in neighborhood after neighborhood, particularly in cities. You saw New York City depopulate by 1 million people between 1970 and 1980 as the crime rate rose. And all of those people were white ethnics living in Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx, all of whom no longer felt themselves protected in any way, shape, or form from muggings, from burglaries, from rapes, all of that.
Can I make an observation about your narrative? Which I agree with, but I will say that so far there's a difference in that Democratic politicians are not lionizing or saying that the killing
Some are.
Ro Khanna went on a Twitter.
Some are.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tiffany
so maybe
Caban.
I'm thinking of Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania.
Governor Shapiro,
who
Governor Fetterman.
very quickly
Senator
said,
Fetterman, yes.
This guy is a monster and a murderer, and you shouldn't. But so
John Podhoretz here, his father, Norman Podhoretz, wrote a famous essay circa 1963. I can't even quote the essay's title, one of the most influential essays ever published in American political life, but I can't even quote the title. It was my and then favored group, problem, and ours. And he points out that this group, which is consistently fawned over and sympathized with by the news media and by our elites, that this supposedly oppressed group was the very group that was continually beating him up and beating up his friends and oppressing him.
So maybe there are
but
some.
The party is split. The left is. Let's not say that Josh Shapiro and Fetterman are leftists, because that's
right. So when I simply talked about this Norman Podhoretz essay in a previous YouTube stream, it got a strike. So it's an essay that cannot be elucidated, cannot even be named on YouTube, where I'm very likely to get a strike.
That's not fair. But on the left of center, there's clear
right to point out that certain groups that often claim to be the oppressed and to be the victims are rather primarily oppressors and victimizers. That when you look at interracial violence in the United States, right, it is overwhelmingly not white people killing non-white people, but the other way around, right? Then you're just cruising for a YouTube strike and for restriction on your content, and they'll remove all sorts of perks from your channel if you just say the truth, right? The YouTube algorithm is set up so that if you say certain basic truths, you will be punished.
Clearly split. Politicians who need to appeal to a large number of people, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania, we have Fetterman and Shapiro, both of whom are up in 26, saying this guy's a monster. I hope he rots in jail, and everybody like him is thrown in jail, and they're terrible. And then you have the recently defeated Jamal Bowman, Ed D, as we now know him on Twitter, Jamal Bowman, Ed D, because some school system foolishly made him a principal for a while, writing a Dear White People tweet storm about how the death of Jordan Neely is yet another example of how we black people watch you white people kill us every day, and you do nothing. And how many more times am I going to have to appeal to you to see that you should see clear reason that you're slaughtering us in the streets? Tiffany Caban, almost district attorney from Queens, now a member of the city council of New York, praising Jordan Neely. Jasmine Crockett, congresswoman from Texas, saying, why isn't anybody helping Jordan Neely, somebody who had nearly killed a woman 3 years ago and had open access to voluntary hospitalization, to voluntary housing, and went on that subway car as the Michael Jackson impersonator and said, "I'm going to kill all of you."
But there's an important distinction here that I think helps us think about how this might play out in the future, and that's that the people we're talking about, the ones who say what's important here isn't the individual's action. It's not Jordan Neely being violent and threatening people. It's not this kid killing someone. It's the underlying causes, and we should look at those causes, both of their personal circumstances. In the case of Neely, he was failed by the system, he was homeless, this is why he behaved this way, excusing the behavior, or the mission of this self-appointed assassin was legit because the healthcare system is a mess. Those are two separate things. But what's interesting about the Jordan Neely case is that a jury of Daniel Penny's peers looked at that evidence, heard the Black Lives Matter activists outside their deliberation room screaming and yelling, and still said, you know what? This was not legitimate. It was not legitimate to argue that we should excuse this man's behavior, and what this other guy did was a hero. Whereas I think what we're seeing in the case, well, what we'll have to see, but with this assassination attempt, I think you'll see, again, because it's more about, it's this very technocratic, difficult, complicated system of healthcare, who a lot of people individually have been frustrated with in America. There's more sympathy for that narrative. And we should think about how the public accepts this narrative too. This is used by politicians. It's used by media figures on the left because it works with the American people. If you talk to people and say, what do you think of the healthcare system? Some people who were otherwise rational, they're not going to excuse assassination, but they will express their frustration with it. So the narrative does work with the public up to a point, and that's a concern going forward too.
And also that element of the healthcare system, we should say, is something that people deal with regularly and is not, some of these things are not part of the discussion at all about policy. And that's one of the reasons that some of these people are jumping up and saying, yeah, let's talk about this, because when they talk about healthcare reform, they tend to talk about, large things and major policy changes through the whole system, and not like, hey, there's this thing where doctors, who are technically out of network come into the emergency room, and then you get a bill, right? So there's like that's part of it too, which is that there's people who deal with this sort of stuff who never see it in conversation at all. Are like, well, I guess that was my chance, but it's just a pretty morbid chance.
I just want to add something to the discussion that Matt and John were having there about the Democratic politicians' reactions. I think even if you set aside the overt sort of enthusiasts like Jamal Bowman here, there is a reality that for years, the Democratic establishment has been trying to meet the mob halfway and sort of say, well, I understand. They have a point, as many Democrats said of let's say the pro-Hamas crowd, or the mostly peaceful riots, or the whatever else it is. And that, I think, first of all, is clear as day to most Americans. They see that, and that doesn't, I think, fly with the American public. I don't think they do like that. It is a problem. It's something that they're going to have to extirpate. Right. They're going to have to stop doing that.
I mean, there is a difference between mob violence and a shooter who, in his letter that the authorities obtained, say, "I'm going to save you the trouble. I acted alone." So there's just a difference. And but I would also add this. So much of the celebration.
So there was a synagogue that was firebombed in Melbourne, Australia, and I've read a lot of comments about how this is the fault of the anti-Israel Labor government in Australia, and I was quite skeptical of that. But I just saw this story.
One family in particular has a terrible story. An Australian Holocaust survivor will celebrate her 100th birthday in a few weeks' time. And she wanted to be surrounded by her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren. But some of them live in Israel. And 2 family members have not been granted visas to enter Australia because of their military service in the Israeli Defense Force. Again, it's compulsory for all young Israelis. So this Australian Holocaust survivor, her 21-year-old great-granddaughter, didn't get a visa and then has had to now go back to the army. Her leave ran out. She may never get to see her great-grandmother again. At 100, you just don't know how much time you have left. Now, the second family member is currently stranded in Thailand. He's been there for 2 weeks. The family has been frantically calling Tony Burke's office to no avail for weeks now. They're left in limbo. So Albanese stands up at the Holocaust Museum to speak about anti-Semitism today, but this is how his government is treating a Holocaust survivor who's an Australian citizen. At the very moment the Albanese...
So, in effect, the Australian government is overwhelmingly denying visas to Israelis. If they've served in the IDF, you're not allowed to visit Australia. That's the platform, that's the program, that's the implementation of Australia's left-of-centre Labor government right now.
Celebration of Mangione has occurred online, and there are hostile foreign powers at work online, manipulating social media. And I would not be surprised if those hostile foreign powers are involved in amplifying some of the celebrations of his awful deed, as well as the criticisms of the American system. I would just caution us not to go too far in accepting.
It never occurred to me to celebrate or express sympathy for Luigi Mangione. It's hard for me to try to get into the mindset of someone who thinks that this kind of murder is understandable and quite worthy of sympathy. The insurance firms aren't the bad guys. They're just a business in a heavily regulated industry where they have to pay out something like 85 to 90% of premiums. They have to pay out in health coverage. So I don't know what health system you would prefer compared to the United States. Where do you think things are just much better?
This narrative that Americans are so upset at their health insurer that they're willing to commit bloody murder in the streets, because I don't think that's where we're at. And I think Mangione's either deranged or he's a terrorist, and he needs to. He can't go on the death row because the murder happened in New York, but he certainly needs to spend the rest of his life in prison. And final comment: I think this events of the past week expose the idiocy of the narrative of the race hustlers you mentioned, John. What's their narrative? White privilege. Okay, let's talk about privilege. Daniel Penny, Luigi, they're both white. One was privileged, right? Class privilege. Luigi Mangione. And what did that class privilege turn out? To a murderer. Daniel Penny, he didn't have any privilege. He's stuck on the subway after serving his country, and he does the right thing, trying to protect the people in that subway car. And Alvin Bragg tries to put him in prison and ruins over a year of his life, right? Because in lawfare, the process is the penalty, as our friend Andy McCarthy always says. So there's no privilege. The privilege is a kid who goes to goes to prep school, UPenn, and becomes, intrigued with self-help and the Unabomber. The terrorists tend to come from privileged backgrounds. The heroes, like Daniel Penny, come from working class, modest backgrounds.
One reason that I brought up the 60s is that a topic that has consumed conversation between Abe and me for a year, and really arose from the fact that Trump was so close in the polls all through 2023 and 2024, was this question of how America would respond, or how liberal leftist America would respond if Trump won the election in 2024, particularly given the explosion of violence and extra legal and criminal action on college campuses throughout the past year that seemed to be breeding a kind of cadre of Americans who might
So I was just working on an essay this morning. Why did people on the right react so strongly against what, in retrospect, seemed to me to be sensible precautions with regard to the COVID pandemic? And in large part, it is because of the abuse of power by our leading institutions, promoting sympathy for motorists and for things like the LA riots, right? When you had the LA riots burn through Los Angeles and dozens of people are killed and billions of dollars of damage occur in just a few days, and the overwhelming tone of the news coverage, particularly in Los Angeles from the Los Angeles Times, is understanding the rage, sympathy for the rioters and the murderers and the rapists and the plunderers and those destroying our city. And when you had the Watts riots in the 1960s, again, the primary tone of the news coverage is understanding and sympathizing with those burning down the city and committing heinous acts such as murder. And so ordinary Americans are tired of liberal overreach where all sorts of compassion is extended to horrible, horrible people who act in awful ways. If you go through an education, you are susceptible. Every year there seems to be a different fad that just blows through education. And you don't really understand what's happening when you're a kid. But when you look back, you just see, oh, yeah, this year they're in the grip of this fad, and then the next year in the grip of that fad. But all the fads have something in common. They all came from left of center. The education system is overwhelmingly in the hands of the left. People who study public health, overwhelmingly on the left. The professions, from medicine to law to accounting to dentistry, these professions are overwhelmingly in the hands of the left. Which political party has most wanted to closely regulate your life? And with some exceptions, such as abortion, is primarily been those on the left who have wanted to bully you and to push you and to regulate you and to tell you what to do. And so against that backdrop, right, non-leftist Americans had initially an understandable reaction to COVID lockdowns and to restrictive COVID policies. Now, my position is that overall, the people in charge of the United States with regard to COVID did a better than average job with the challenge of COVID. I believe that our primary response to them should be gratitude. I believe that Tony Fauci generally spoke for the medical consensus with regard to COVID. Not that he was 100% right, but about 90% of the time he was speaking for the medical consensus. And I agree with the public health consensus on COVID that prior to the vaccine, social distancing was generally a good idea. And then once we had the vaccines, it's a good idea to get vaccinated. And it was a good idea for the government to send people money. When you're imposing social distancing, send them money, spend trillions of dollars to keep the economy working. So I generally think that the people operating this country with regard to COVID did a better than average job. Now, at the same time, I recognize that there are quite cogent right-wing critiques of COVID reduction policies, such as the need to balance our needs for human connection with the benefits of social distancing, the stupid big government social distancing overreach, such as when the government restricted people from hiking and going to the beach and going to the park, right? Getting outside to exercise, going to the beach, going to the park, going hiking. That's a great idea during an influenza epidemic. The idiocy and cruelty and just the terrible policy pushed by the teacher unions that kept schools closed for 2 years instead of just the first 9 months before we had COVID vaccine availability. And I think conservatives were generally right when they opposed our government's imposed vaccine mandates and throwing people out of the U.S. military because they would not get vaccinated. So I recognize the left-wing value of harm reduction and the left-wing value of fairness. These impulses are often adaptive. In plenty of situations, the left-wing has a more adaptive approach to a particular situation than the right. So some situations, the left-wing approach works better. Other situations, right-wing responses work better. Harm reduction sounds wonderful, but if you put too much value on harm reduction, then you're going to significantly reduce freedom of speech. So there was an academic study released July 10, 2021, trying to figure out why conservatives were more resistant to COVID lockdown and pro-vaccine measures. Because initially, you would expect people on the right to be more sensitive to threat, to disease threat, and to the threat of contagion. So why was it that overall U.S. conservatives were less concerned than liberals with regard to the COVID pandemic? And the primary reason is that COVID reduction measures clashed with right-wing tendencies of limited government. And so we all tend to see the world from where we stand. And if you're tired of being bullied and lectured and hectored and manipulated and punished and restricted overwhelmingly from entities on the left, then it's understandable when you see these same behaviors of bullying coming along with regard to COVID, that you have a negative reaction to them. So conservatives cared less, liberals cared more about the COVID outbreak. Now, the more firsthand direct experience you had with COVID, meaning you got sick or people close to you got sick or people close to you died, then the effects of ideology considerably diminished. And then once you had considerable direct experience with COVID killing people around you, then you were going to take COVID as seriously as someone on the left side of the political spectrum. But prior to being personally devastated by COVID, right, you had a lens looking at the world. And so conservatives and liberals viewed the pandemic through their own political lens. And this political lens led them to assign more or less threat to the disease. People on the left were right? COVID was a very serious problem. But for conservatives, they do not want government restrictions. They do not want big government. And so they were motivated to downplay the severity of the threat until they had enough firsthand experience with how devastating it was. So it wasn't Donald Trump's dismissive message about COVID, right? It wasn't about Donald Trump. It was something much more fundamentally ideological. So we usually belong to a group, and our group usually has a hero system or an ideology. And so what happens in the world around us, we will tend to see through the lens of our group. And so if public health authorities and politicians said our primary response to COVID should be immigration restriction, we should stop allowing people into the country, then overwhelmingly people on the right would have supported that policy response. So if you're part of a group who feels that a pandemic will hurt your ideological perspective, will hurt your political side, will damage your hero system, then you're going to be much more incentivized to deny that threat. So people who weren't hating Donald Trump, they also saw how COVID was being used to hurt Donald Trump, and that also fueled skepticism of what people in public health were telling them. So if a conservative believes that a threatening pandemic will hurt his ideological ends, he'll be less likely to see it as threatening. If liberals believe a threatening pandemic will help their ideological ends, they will view it as more threatening. So we had an Atlantic magazine headline, "Red and Blue America are not experiencing the same pandemic." So the point of divergence is not because of information sources. It's not because of political messaging. It's because conservatives and liberals have different hero systems that predispose them to believe that COVID is more or less threatening. But these differences start to disappear once people are impacted directly by COVID. Also, the people who are overwhelmingly running the American COVID response were on the left, and they often used words and they used communication strategies that just rubbed Republicans the wrong way. So much of the ornery rejection of common sense public health messages during COVID developed because of the way it was communicated by the people in charge. And if you looked at the preoccupations of people in public health prior to COVID, right, it was obviously a left-wing dominated sector. And so it would then make sense that those who are not on the left reacted to COVID pronouncements with considerable skepticism and suspicion until you have suffered directly. So if you are not on the left, then throughout your life, you have felt the left and our leading institutions, which are overwhelmingly dominated by the left, are continually using threatening emergencies, real emergencies, putative emergencies, from climate change to homelessness to trans, right, to increase their power over us. And when you have power, you rarely have unlimited power. And so there are all sorts of things that you should never say to other people, even if you have power, if you're hoping to get their cooperation. And many public health authorities and other people in power say the equivalent of these things, and then they get a hostile response. So I'm drawing on a terrific 2013 book, Verbal Judo, The Gentle Art of Persuasion. And it lists off 11 things never to say to anyone. So instruction 1, come here. Right, when someone is commanding you, come here, right, it's going to get your back up. So 2, if you're talking to someone or interviewing someone and you say, tell me about yourself, that's not a question, that's a command. People don't react well to commands. If people in charge during COVID had been more humble, talked about how little we know, talked about what they see as the threat, but recognizing how the evidence isn't particularly clear, right, you would be less likely to get those not already aligned with you to have their back up and to resist you. Another thing you should never say to anyone, you wouldn't understand, or because those are the rules, or it's none of your business, or what do you want me to do about it, or calm down, what's your problem, you never or you always. I'm not going to say this again. Right? Anytime you find yourself having to say that, it's false. You will say what you're about to say again and again and again. I'm doing this for your own good. And why don't you be reasonable? Right? No one responds well to any of these messages. And it was in part the bullying messaging during COVID that got so much resistance in America. Far more resistance in America compared to any other prosperous nation.
Purpose their anger toward other things as time moved on. You know, whether this was a kind of, they were put in a kiln on October 8th, baked, came out, you know, fully cooked, and were then ready for other action. And so I thought that if so, that would mean there would be riots after the election and all of that. And obviously that did not happen. What happened in the United States after Richard Nixon defeated Hubert Humphrey and then came into the presidency and did not immediately withdraw forces from Vietnam or whatever, wasn't, I mean, there were a couple of big demonstrations and stuff. And obviously there was Kent State in 1970 where an anti-war demonstration turned unexpectedly and tragically violent and other such incidents. But other stuff happened. The radicals of 1968, not that many of them, but enough of them, turned into terrorists. And I'm not saying they turned into terrorists like, you know, they published manifestos online and said they were full of joy because somebody shot a healthcare worker. The Weathermen, who were domestic terrorists in the United States, grew out of a cell at Columbia University our favorite college, Matt's alma mater, and blew up a townhouse on 11th Street in 1970, where they were manufacturing and fashioning bombs to use on military recruitment centers and banks all over the Northeast. There were 1,200 domestic bombings in the United States, according to Brian Burrow's book, Days of Rage, between 1969 and 1973. The Black Panthers were a street gang in San Francisco, largely committing robberies and things like that, morphed into a political force. And among the things that we learn from Daniel Talbot's book, Season of the Witch, which is a history of San Francisco.
Right, the zebra killings where some blacks deliberately targeted whites for murder in San Francisco hasn't received much news media attention over the years. So Jonathan Haidt has an interesting set of 5 pillars of morality, right? There's care, harm. So the more you emphasize harm reduction, the more likely you are to be on the left. And simultaneously, because you're so concerned about harm reduction, you're also going to emphasize free speech restriction. Fairness and reciprocity, that is equally shared by people on the left and right. Loyalty versus betrayal, there's a much stronger value on the right. Authority, the importance of authority, stronger value on the right. And sanctity, purity versus contagion and degradation, much stronger value on the right than the left. So conservative and liberals both recognize the case for harm reduction and for fairness, but the 3 remaining foundational values are overwhelmingly accepted on the right. And so this difference in moral foundations explains the different ways that Republicans and Democrats experience the coronavirus. So 97% of Democrats said they were seriously concerned about corona, while only 39% of Republicans said the same thing. This is May of 2020. So Facebook rolled out early on during COVID a care emoji, right? An emoji hugging a heart. It was intended to show caring and solidarity when commenting on a status update. So this care language is usually much stronger on the left. So Republican governors were much more reluctant than Democratic governors to impose sweeping restrictions on their residents. So these governors also wanted to reduce harm, but their moral framework gave them a heightened concern of other social considerations such as civil liberties and the importance of family and human connection and practicing your religion. So the COVID lockdowns ripped away many of America's most cherished civil liberties, such as the freedom to assemble, the right to purchase a gun, the ability to travel freely, the freedom to attend church, right? And these restrictions also put thousands of companies on a path towards bankruptcy by prohibiting them from engaging in commerce. And these infringements were by and large regarded as reasonable to liberals because they put so much emphasis on harm reduction. And Gretchen Whitmer saw no problem in suspending Freedom of Information Act to prevent outside groups from assessing the model that state officials used to justify locking down the entire state. So it's no wonder that people who valued free speech, right, would have a very strong reaction to unilateral imposition of doing away with rights and simultaneously suspending the Freedom of Information Act to prevent any open assessment of the model that politicians are using to justify their lockdowns. If you view civil liberties and your constitutional rights as sacred, however, you're not going to be comfortable with this sweeping lockdown approach. So liberals and conservatives have different moral frameworks, and an essential part of the conservative moral framework is that people who do horrible things, such as murder, should be punished, often executed. Let me play a little bit more here from John Podhoretz.
In the 20th century is that there was a period of time, I think in 1972, when one of the policies that the Panthers had adopted was that they were driving around San Francisco looking for lone white people walking on a street at night and then would shoot them dead. There were 10 or 15 such cases. You remember, if you're old enough to remember this, in 1992 or 1993, there was this bizarre incident around Washington, D.C., where there was this sniper shooting people at gas stations and places like that. The entire city and environs of Washington, D.C. basically shut down. People stopped going out at night. It was
2002.
Was it 2002? Was it that late?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
it was post 9/11.
Okay. So it turned out that it was this 14-year-old kid and his stepfather who were on.
Is a weird term to describe that relationship.
Okay.
We never really got that.
We never really got.
Mohammed was the name of the terrorist who was going around the DC area shooting people, and he had a companion who was.
Yeah, Lee Malvo, right, was the companion who was the gunman, right? He was.
I think
it doesn't matter.
I think they're both shooting, but yeah.
The point is, like, random shootings are the heart of terrorism. Terrorism is not. We think about 9/11 as being the model of terrorism. That is actually not the model of terrorism. Is random violence against lone individuals with no reason behind it. That's when you start talking about anarchists of the 19th century. Aside from political assassinations, of which there were plenty in the 1870s and 1880s here and in Russia and in Western Europe,
in
Serbia, right? The act of going around and just finding somebody to kill so that you could terrorize, very, very high reward, low risk, high reward benefit. You just shoot somebody dead.
All right. So those Americans who are most supportive of capital punishment simultaneously were the most resistant to many of the COVID restrictions, right? They were the same type of Americans who overwhelmingly supported the Tea Party, right? This was a specific character type, right? Someone who becomes ornery when he feels that his self-image as a free and independent individual is under assault. I'm reading from an essay in progress by Ronnie Goodman. So by resisting the cognitive elites who are constantly trying to bully and tame and subdue and regulate and control them, right, those Americans who fought COVID restrictions, right, also fight in other parts of life to hold back, at least for another day, the dusk of decadence that comes whenever the forces of order have triumphed too completely over the anarchic will of free men. So these American right-wingers see themselves as civilization's defenders, that they are upholding a traditional social order against the chaotic forces of modernity. Right? They see themselves as oppressed by our major institutions, by the intrusions of liberal civility, and they look skeptically at public health as just another vehicle for some kind of foreign colonial project inimical to their own more natural and indigenous ethos. And so liberals see this ornery attitude as gratuitous, pointless, antisocial attitude. But for the people who have the attitude, it is an imperative to try to preserve their freedom against the enervating influence of progressive universalism, with its often intrusive drive to regulate, to bully, to inculcate in people an ever-widening obedience to the hero system of globalist liberalism. It's also a rebellion against wokeness, the idea that there are certain identities that are sacred, such as Black identity, gay identity, trans identity, and anyone who possesses such a sacred identity must be held immune from public criticism. So people who were on the left felt put upon. They felt bullied once again. They felt intruded on. They felt regulated by what were ostensibly apolitical admonitions to help curb COVID transmission by masking and social distancing and getting vaccinated. And so from the liberal perspective, right, these weren't major sacrifices when compared to the benefits. But for the people who oppose these things, right, these things are not just practical inconveniences, they are symbolic expressions of a hero system and an ethos that is absolutely foreign to them, to their more authentic libertarian live and let live attitudes. So among the upper middle class liberals, right, they don't understand the importance of class differences in shaping attitudes toward life. They fail to reckon with the class dimension of their obsession with health and moral uplift. And there are some good things about being obsessed with health and moral uplift, but it can also reduce your ability to thrive and to enjoy the present. Right? This hygienic conception of life has many benefits, particularly during a time of contagion and epidemic. but it can also drain life of purpose and meaning and excitement. The hygienic conception of life that is pushed by our social betters, by our public health authorities, does not command universal enthusiasm. Because from the perspective of the independent American, right, beneath the smiling face of this upper middle class benevolence is a venomous hatred for their ornery, free way of life. Whenever ordinary Americans resist this liberal impulse to bully, to regulate, to educate, to command, right, then this liberalism turns nasty and ultimately invokes the power of the government. So the anti-vaxxers, right, are simply tired of the interventions of out-of-touch experts, people who lack the instinctual wisdom born of the ordinary American's fair dinkum life experience. Right? It's a rebellion. Anti-vaccination is a rebellion against the technocratic presumptions of a self-satisfied liberal elite and the liberal elite's haughty disdain for the hardier, less safety-obsessed, less hygienic ways of the ordinary American. So watch the TV shows Landman and Yellowstone to get a feel and a celebration for this ordinary American who is tired of being bullied and regulated to death by the liberal elite. So the American rights vaccine rejection is not primarily based on abstract libertarian commitments, such as to bodily autonomy, right? It is a rebellion against being bullied by the liberal elite. It is a resentment against the bullying and regulation and encroachment of this foreign hero system. It is a rebellion against this dominant ethos among our elite that the two most important things in life are for everyone to be happy and for everyone to get along. No, the ordinary American is saying that there are more important things than my individual happiness and just getting along with people. So public health officials often lacked candor during the pandemic because they did not want to create public distrust. And so they made all sorts of overstatements and confident assertions which were not supported by data. And they did this to, further their ends. But while engaging in a lack of candor, they undercut and diminished public trust by the right side of the American political spectrum. And they fueled all sorts of COVID conspiracy theories. So those who were in charge, they wanted to impart respect for the pandemic severity, and they weren't particularly concerned with conveying the limits of their understanding, of their knowledge, or the scientific background for what they're claiming. And they thought any kind of compromise, any kind of openness about how much they didn't know would lead to the public feeling more at ease with ignoring their prescriptions. So their messaging exuded contempt for the unwashed peasants, right, who just could not be trusted to handle complexity and needed simple directives with simple explanations. But this messaging was experienced as patronization. It was experienced as arrogant, and it sparked a backlash, right? It sparked a rebellion against this liberal elite's hygienic conception of life. Right. So prior to COVID, right, Middle America already felt denigrated and marginalized and intruded upon and overly regulated and bullied and experimented on by their cultural overlords. And so populists were not generally capable of the kind of detachment that I am describing here, right? They would take the noble half-truths of the public health authorities as personal insults, as just another slap in the face by elites, and so they went ever deeper into their rabbit holes, dug for the singular purpose of triggering the libs. Their anti-elite resentment, it goes hand in hand with anti-vaccine conspiracism, because it's the resentment that enables the conspiracists to conceive of the elite as some kind of inhuman Borg-like entity of which individual actors are just unthinking tentacles. So the elite who want to regulate and to bully and to impose restrictions on ordinary Americans, they are seen as part of a cohesive hive mind because the policies seem to require bee-like social and political coordination. So when you hate a group, right, you are going to give short shrift to the complexity of the very real human motivations and vulnerabilities of this group that you hate. You're not going to spend much time recognizing that they have to interact with all the intricacies of shifting social context just like you do. But when you hate a group and you hate the elite's hygienic conception of life and you feel it's such an affront to your way of life, you will just find ways to dismiss those who are particularly bullying. Venomous hatred that lies just beneath the smiling face of this upper class benevolence.
Dead on the street. Every single CEO in the United States now is scrambling to find 24-hour, 7-day-a-week protection, maybe for the rest of their lives. This is an extraordinarily effective
And I
terrorist act that Mr. Mangione pulled off.
He was on a laptop when the cops found him. So he was following the coverage of his events. And I would not be surprised if he had plans for another attack. I mean, just looking at, I know it's based on little visual evidence, but just looking at how he responded to those cameras, you almost get the sense that he's in his head is thinking of himself as the Joker or something like that. Somebody who's
Bane.
or Bane.
Well, and what's funny about that is that,
I mean, even the movie, right? If you think about the two recent Joker movies, the whole plot is that the character played by Joaquin Phoenix commits this awful atrocity, and then everybody actually, not everybody, but he inspires people to join him, right? And
what was the online debate going into the Joker when it was first released? There was a huge outcry about how this was going to encourage white male violence.
Incels.
Incel and white male vigilantism.
This is important because I think that's part of the reason why it's very difficult for a lot of our legacy media institutions and the people who work for them to understand what's happening in the way that we're discussing it. And that's because we've been told for decades that it's Christian white nationalists, it's incels, it's all these bad right-wing people who are the domestic terrorists.
This is very important because on my favorite podcast and John's, NPR's Up First, they have tasked their extremism reporter to cover Mangione. And of course, the extremism reporter's job is supposed to cover right-wing extremism. And now she finds herself having to cover this case, which I think will be kind of an obsession for America for some time, and maybe even getting to the equivalent of the O.J. Simpson case 30 years ago. But she's covering this case, which is clearly anti-capitalist violence. And if you think about all the political violence we're talking about,
and looking at the chat, notes that the play West Side Story exemplifies follow your bliss, love conquers all, common ideal on the left, while the most common ideal on the right is do your duty. And you watch shows like Landman and Yellowstone, and you see that the ethos of these regular Americans is primarily around doing their duty.
It's, as A points out at the top of the show, it's emanating from the left. I mean, think about what's been going on outside of Atlanta for years now, this kind of weird Antifa fight against the so-called Cop City, Atlanta PD training facility. You think about the disgusting acts of vandalism against great works of Western art that the climate radicals have been doing. Black Lives Matter, of course, came up at the attempted assassination of Brett Kavanaugh, the two attempted assassination on Trump. We talked about the baseball team shooter, the Capitol baseball team
nearly
shooter.
Killed Steve Scalise.
He nearly killed Steve Scalise.
The whip.
Rand Paul was at that site, and then he got beat up in a dispute with his neighbor a few years later. There is just last night, there's reports that a man attempted to assault Nancy Mace because of her.
He didn't attempt to assault Nancy Mace. He assaulted Nancy Mace.
He assaulted her.
She's in a sling, and he's
okay. I didn't see that.
He's a trans activist,
and he's a trans,
clear
right?
That he's trans. He's pro-trans.
So maybe the media can wake up for a second and just look. The scales of justice here. Obviously, there are far-right, racist, anti-Semitic extremists. Obviously, January 6th was a riot at the Capitol. But
the left-wing extremism is really weighing down that scale.
Can I make a point about the way that this is portrayed? Because this is something that's been bothering me for a long time, which is the way that these things are reported when it's right-wing or can be blamed on right-wing ideology. And when it's violence, it can be blamed on right-wing ideology. The coverage is about how there is a pipeline of extremism and a network, and all these things are connected. And these are, we see projected onto the ceiling like a planetarium, these constellations, right? And the way that they write these stories is like when you're sitting at a planetarium and certain constellations light up and the other ones fade out. That's how we read about right-wing violence. Left-wing violence is always lone wolf, is always a single event. It doesn't mean that, AOC is a
or they say they had a point
or whatever.
Right. Well, so let's go to they had a point.
Right.
Go back to where I was, where a couple minutes ago. The they had a point argument is the argument that says it's terrible what he did. It's a terrible thing. It's terrible what the Panthers shouldn't be going around killing.
So as you get older, you realize that people don't usually say what they mean and don't usually mean what they say. And the more realistic your understanding of life and the more realistic your understanding of yourself, the better enabled you are to peel away the false masks that people wear. So going back to this essay in progress here by Ronnie Goldman, and this section header is called The Moral Masks of Modernity. And so in this essay, he's comparing the anti-vax conspiracy theorists with the fat acceptance activists. And he notes that both of them engaged in one of the most characteristic modern of activities, the project of unmasking the unacknowledged motives of arbitrary will and desire, which sustain the moral mass of modernity. So for example, I might volunteer in a position ostensibly to be doing good, but what may be primarily driving me is that I get to boss a lot of people around. While in the rest of life, I don't have that opportunity, so I look for a volunteer position perhaps so that I can boss other people around. And so that would be unmasking what's really going on behind the moral mask. What's really going on is me perhaps bullying people. And so for those who promote fat acceptance, right, they want to celebrate the authenticity of the noble gastronomic savage, overcoming the artificial, socially coerced obsession with thinness in favor of her natural appetite for rich and sugary foods. And for right-wing anti-vaxxers, it's the authenticity of the ordinary American liberated from the mystique of progressive expertise who enjoys the natural health bestowed by living a fair dinkum life, right? An authentic life. And both ideologies are calling for a return to a state of nature in rude defiance of the forces that would suffocate this emancipation. So fat acceptance is an FU to the patriarchy, and for anti-vaxxers, there's a FU to the liberal elites. And both movements are not primarily concerned with the state of the science with regard to the health dangers of obesity and being unvaccinated, but they are primarily concerned with the social positioning of their group in a cultural hierarchy and validating their group as against the impositions of outgroups.
People. But look, it's terrible injustice toward Black people in the United States. I mean, what do you expect people to do when they feel frustrated and they don't see justice? Like they're going to take justice into their own hands.
Okay,
we
let's
expect
bring
them to not murder.
Kip back onto the show. What's going on, Kip?
Hey, buddy. I know tonight you were talking about truth and harm reduction. And I don't know, I learned from a young age that sometimes the optics can matter more than the truth. Back at Booker T. Washington in 5th grade, this guy named Harold and this other guy named Alan, they tripped me out on the playground. And then, like a dummy, 10 minutes later, I walked back by them to see if it would happen again. Sure enough, it happened again. And it really got to me because they was looking at each other laughing about it after the fact. But I dusted myself off. And a few minutes later, I came back and they made a sort of a miscalculation. They did not pay attention to the Tonka trucks, the bag of Tonka trucks in my right hand. and they tripped me for a third time, and I lit them up with that bag of Tonka trucks. It was ugly. There was blood everywhere, and I remember being drugged down the hall by the teacher towards the principal's office, saying, 3 times they tripped me, 3 times. But there was so much blood, Luke, on their face. The optics looked so bad. The truth had gotten lost somewhere in the 8th or 10th hit from the bag of Tonka trucks to their face. You ever had a situation like that happen where the truth just gets lost in it?
Yes, and one of the stupidest things that adults say to kids is, "I don't care who started it." I mean, who started it is important. It's an essential component of trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, and something about when people are having a funny at my expense, it didn't go well, because let's fast forward to say 1990. I don't even think I was a year out of being out of the Marines. I was in a nightclub, and the live band was playing, and I was drinking, and I was out of beer, so I went to get another pitcher. And as I was waiting for him to fill the pitcher up, a guy pinched me on the cheek and called me cutie pie. But he looked at his friend, and they were smiling and smirking at each other and thought it was funny. And when he did it a second time, I mean, just before I knew it, instinctually, I had punched him. He was on the ground. I was standing over him, threatening him, his friend. And, things happen in a blur when you've been drinking. Well, you don't know this, but Luke, things happen in a blur when you're drinking. And next thing I know, there was a cop that had my arm twisted in some kind of way that really hurt bad. And he was throwing me out of the bar, And then I got in my car, I'm looking for the next watering hole. And a cop pulls me over, claims he's noticed my driving, but he didn't notice my driving. He had actually gotten called from the previous cop, that had thrown me out of the bar. This cop car had actually almost passed me, and then he realized I was the guy. I was the drunk he needed to check out and pull over. So the truth didn't matter then. I spent the night in jail, got a DUI. That's a long time ago. That's actually over a third of a century ago now. But all because a guy wanted to pinch me on the cheek and call me cutie pie. And this is the point, Luke, where you're supposed to tell me it ain't about them pinching me on the cheek. It's supposed to be about me being a bigger man and not walking beside those two guys and letting them trip me, and not, getting so bent out of shape when somebody pinches me on the cheek and calls me cutie pie. What is it about me that makes me a sucker for this, Luke?
Well, yeah, I think generally speaking, one should abstain from committing violence out of self-interest, in that the kind of violence that you describe can easily escalate, and it just is highly likely to reduce the quality of your life. But punching someone, a stranger who pinches your cheek and calls you cutie pie, is a normal, natural, and perhaps healthy response. And someone who keeps tripping you, that is an assault. And so responding by beating them up is also a normal, natural, and possibly healthy response. I think both of your responses are fairly healthy. There may have been more strategic responses, but these were normal, natural responses to being assaulted.
Yeah, but Luke, that's a DUI. I had to carry some ridiculous thing called SR22 insurance, which basically was like triple the rate, quadruple the rate. You know what I mean? It's something that hung over your head for years. The insurance company dangled that over me for maybe 5 years after the fact. So that's a big price to pay.
How much do you think it cost you in total?
I mean, I would say $1,500, maybe $2,000, and those would be 1990 at latest, $1991. So
and a lot of aggravation and some sleepless nights and a lot of negative feelings associated with all that. So yeah, you would have strategically been better off not punching those guys in the bar. Yeah,
one reason I let's say I went straight over the years is just the worst night of a man's life. Now it's changed now. I think you actually got to kill somebody to get in trouble now. But the worst time is the night that you're trying to sleep before you go to see the judge, because you know everything down to jaywalking, they can throw the book at you for 11 months and 29 days or whatever it is, and that's always going through your head. But I don't know. There comes a point where you just say, "Hey, it ain't worth it. It just ain't worth it running with the big dogs late at night anymore. I'm gonna act a little bit more grown up and leave this behind me." But
you said something important. It's changed now, depending on the location. All right, so law enforcement is highly variable depending on the officer, the court, the county, the city, the state. There's no generalizable tendency. It's just all over the place. So you need to know what your particular situation is like. All right, there are some places where you can get away with a lot more than other places. And so, for example, there's a law in the Talmud that says the law of the land, meaning the law of the Gentile land in which you live, is law to the Jew. But this is the law as it is enforced, not the law on the books, but the law as it is practiced. And so one needs to be hip to the reality of how law is practiced. And if you are not hip to it, then you probably want to err on the side of safety. Also, many employers are currently firing employees for the most trivial of reasons because they don't want to pay severance. And so if they can find that you've broken some rule, then they have an excuse to get rid of you without being liable for litigation and without having to pay you severance. So you're going to have an easier life if you abide by the rules and if you have a sophisticated understanding of which rules are enforced and which are not.
Yeah. When you got here in 1977, incidentally, one of my favorite shows to watch sometimes is Chips, because it shows,
I remember, yeah,
bunches of cars from 1981, from that time frame. And it works like a time machine for my mind, and it really takes me back. But when you got here in 1977, speaking of the law, two things became. The cops just decided they were just going to start taking a stand on two things. One of them was DUI, and the other thing was domestic violence. Up till about 77 to 1980, you could get pulled over from a cop, and he was just glad you didn't kill yourself. He'd give you a ride home, tell you come back, let your wife bring you back to your car tomorrow or whatever. Same thing went for domestic violence. They just tried to play peacekeeper. And then, something about women's lib and all that kind of stuff, it really changed. But those were two key changes that happened right when you got here in 1977. Those were two things that had just entered everybody's mind. And they had just decided, we're going to take a stand right here. And there's always something, like you can tell, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it was fentanyl. We're going to take a stand with fentanyl. But domestic violence and DUI, they decided to take a stand on those right when you came to America. But one thing I was going to ask you was the way it works with you and the rabbi. Does he just sit you down in January and say, I expect this out of you this year?
It's all over the place. There's no standard relationship between a Jew and his rabbi. So overwhelmingly in America, rabbis have far less power than they did in traditional communities in Eastern Europe. So the more you want from the rabbi and the more you want from the community, then the more you have to get along with the rabbi and obey his dictates. The less that you need from the rabbi and the less that you need from the community, the more independent you are. So I have learned to tread a middle ground. So it's essential to me to be a part of the Orthodox Jewish community and to be a vital part of this synagogue and that synagogue and this section of the community. At the same time, I am not willing to get so deeply, closely, intimately a part of it that I have to surrender all my freedom of speech. So I tread a middle path. I'm a part of the community, but also maintain a little bit of independence so that I can do a live stream and say what I want to say.
As a Gentile, my only reference is like through like, you know, what Jews have said. So my understanding was that you would be sitting in your pretty office and your secretary would say, "Hey, your rabbi's here to see you." And he'd say, 18,000, we'd like to have 18,000. This is a story that I heard a Jew telling. And then he said the next year, you know, same fancy office, same secretary, same setup. He was the man, the manager, whatever. 18,000, we'd expect 18,000. He shook hands, no problem. He said, and then the next year, the third year, he came to see me and I had like folding chairs and a collapsible plastic table. And I had, instead of working for somebody else, I was now on my own. And, you know, he was bootstrapping it and it looked like it, you know. And instead of 18,000, he was hoping that the rabbi would ask him for less. And he said, no, he asked me for 26,000. So you can see me as a Gentile. This is my idea of how it works, but you're saying maybe not quite like that.
Well, that's perhaps how it worked for that guy, but what you don't know is a considerable backstory. So that Jew had a very close relationship with that rabbi, and I expect that rabbi had done all sorts of things for that Jew. So there will be times when rabbis spend the majority of their work time securing jobs for their congregants. There are all sorts of pragmatic ways that rabbis can intervene. They can help bring people together to resolve disputes, or help people come together to go into business together, or facilitate international business deals, or help someone get the medical help that they need, or someone's got a niece who badly needs some very expensive surgery, and the rabbi will arrange things that would normally be thought impossible. So in Jewish life, the community makes, in Orthodox Jewish life in particular, the community makes far more demands on you than you as a Gentile would be comfortable with. At the same time, you can make considerably more demands on the community than you would be used to. So it is a high intensity, high commitment life in Orthodox Judaism, where you have great responsibilities to the community, but the community also has all sorts of responsibilities to take care of you and to look after you and to help you out. So if you have had the rabbi help you out in all sorts of ways, and you have become someone who has attached himself to the rabbi, then the rabbi can make all sorts of demands on you because you've made all sorts of demands on the rabbi.
10-4. So it sounds like what you're telling me is the year that the man asked for 26 and he felt like he was putting him in the bind, he could also say, well, this is a lofty goal, but it'll be the best for both of us if we succeed at it. So I think I'm going to need X, Y, and Z help from the synagogue to make this dream a reality. And that's something you're saying there's more of a back and forth there that maybe I wasn't aware of. That's what you're saying.
Right. There's a relationship. All these quote unquote demands take place within the context of a relationship where the rabbi is doing all sorts of things for this businessman that you would have absolutely no conception of. Right? You don't know how he may have saved the life of a drug addicted child of this man. That the rabbi went onto the streets where this drug addicted son was living, strung out on heroin, and the rabbi cleaned him up, got him into a rehab center, visited the son every day, helped facilitate the son turning his life around. And so let's say a rabbi saves your son's life, all right, you'll naturally be predisposed to donating to that rabbi.
10-4. Now tell me how this would differ from AA. Because my understanding, maybe that works similar with AA, or is it a little bit more anonymous? Is there
completely different? So for one thing, AA will not accept any money from anyone who's not in AA. So if you don't identify as an alcoholic, if you're not a member of AA will not accept your money. Second, AA will not accept more than approximately $2,000 a year from you, even if you are in AA. So all sorts of people in their wills, leave tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to AA that AA refuses, or any 12-step program of which I'm aware will refuse, because they don't want power and prestige and ego interfering with the functioning of a 12-step program. So let's say you're a strung out, homeless heroin addict on the streets, and someone from Heroin Anonymous comes along and says, hey, I think there's a better way, and someone helps you out and gets you into a rehab center, and you turn your life around. That person is not going to be coming to you asking for $10,000. What they might ask you to do is to join them, volunteering, going to visit people who need help.
Right. We were talking the other day about love, and it's funny that I'm going to mention Trump now in the same sentence as love, but there's something about Trump that drives some people insane. You and I, we can see the funny when you show up at the McDonald's and Trump is working the drive-through. You know what I'm saying? or you throw your garbage out and Trump shows up on a brand new pretty garbage truck, with the boys picking up your garbage. I mean, something like that tickles us, but it drives the Sam Harris type insane. And I'm wondering, you say it's hero system and all that, but I don't know. Is it something to do with he used to be a lefty? What is it about him? Because it's almost, you can see that it's whatever that hatred is, it's close to Eros. It's driving them mad the same way that love drives people mad, right? Speak to that, if you could.
Yes. So for people like Sam Harris and for most of our intellectual elite, the individual in his own buffered, meaning his own singular identity without regard to the outside world, can decide right and wrong, meaning and purpose, and he can learn to rationally direct his life and not be the victim of outside forces. And Donald Trump is an embodiment of the unreconstructed individual who lusts, who wants money, who has garish tastes, someone who resists the disciplining effect of this intellectual idealization of a rational, buffered identity where you sublimate all your impulses to the courtly forces of reason. It's the difference between courtier morality and Lord of the Manor morality. So if you are the Lord of your manor, if you are the king of your house, then you feel comfortable fighting in your own home. You feel comfortable telling off-color jokes because you are the Lord of your manor. But let's say that your living depends upon going to court and finding your place at court. Your living now depends upon serving in the court of the king. And now everything that you say, everything that you do has to be closely regulated according to who has the most power and influence, and how the incentives are changing from day to day. As the situation changes, you have to adapt. You have to make sure that your language is disciplined and fits in with what is socially acceptable. And so people like Sam Harris, people who have received university education, by and large have that courtier morality, where they are naturally editing and censoring themselves and adjusting their speech to that which is the correct way of expressing yourself, to show that you're a member of the educated class, that you have internalized the discipline of this Enlightenment, rational, liberal, buffered identity. And you look at people who belch and fart and just say things off the top of their head without the discipline that you enforce on yourself, and you look at them as barbarians, as medieval, as primitive, and they disgust you.
Is there anything, I agree with everything you're saying, but is there anything about Trump that they admire and that maybe pushes him over the edge? Because, I mean, think about how old he is. The drive the man has, Luke Ford. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? Is there something in there? Is there some hidden admiration?
Very rarely. Usually,
Okay.
when people hate someone, they don't make exceptions.
Yeah, Norm Macdonald used to say the reason that is it Alec Baldwin that would do those bad Trump impressions? He said, you got to like the guy. He said, you got to like the guy. And you can tell when Alec Baldwin is doing his Trump impressions, he doesn't like the guy. So it doesn't come off. It doesn't come off as genuine, I guess is what he's saying. But I don't know if you've caught on, but there was a new trend. You and I, we missed out on the Beanie Babies, and we missed out on the Pokemon cards. And I heard you made it big in the laser disc phenomenon back in the 90s. But Hawk Tuah, she had a crypto coin apparently. Do you know this, Hawk Tuah?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And apparently they have a it happens so often that they have a name called a rug pull. A rug pull apparently happened allegedly. We're going to say allegedly because apparently this hasn't gone through the court system or whatever. But what kind of person is sitting around rubbing their hands, thinking that Hawk Tuah is going to be the next Kathy Wood and lead them to financial fame and fortune? What kind of person, Luke? Who could be investing in something as crazy as that?
Someone who enjoys her narrative, who enjoys her story, and as an act of rebellion, the same type of people who bought GameStop. So the elites, right, the people in the know were all shorting GameStop, while regular Americans suddenly bought into GameStop, and so you had GameStop going to incredible heights until government regulators intervened and essentially quashed the massive run up of GameStop stock. When was that? Was that early 2021?
Yeah, sometime in the last couple of years. Yeah, and made me wonder. And you probably haven't checked either, but I wonder what's happened to the United Healthcare stock in the wake of this little kerfuffle.
I think apparently it went up the day he was killed. Went up like 10%.
All these things don't really paint a pretty picture of the future, I don't think, as far as people's thinking. But I realize you draw huge audiences in places like Tajikistan and Tasmania and really all over. And I'm just wondering, should we not be spreading the word far and wide that Disney really should maybe separate themselves from the View? When I think of like Disney as a company, you would think they would want to, right wingers or who has families, right? You would think they would want to be catering to right wingers, but yet the View, which is owned by Disney, it's gotten so bad, Luke. And I know you're not a regular viewer of this show, but it's gotten so bad recently. They had 4 legal notices that had to be read on one episode. Could you imagine pausing the Luke Ford show 4 times in an episode just to read legal notices for some dumb shit Kip said?
Well, I don't believe it's been renewed. I think this is its last season.
Mm-hmm. Made me wonder about all those, on one level, because there was one called The Real, The Talk, The View, and it makes me wonder the way they just all went so left. They and the what you call the late night television. I don't know. Just makes me wonder if they're not. Whoever is advertising there must be big fans of the DNC. Is that what I'm to make of the content?
Approximately half of Americans are not on the right. And so people tend to gather around particular TV shows. People who are watching The View are not on the right. Their audience is overwhelmingly on the left, and they are appealing to that audience. The network late night TV show hosts are on the left and are appealing to a left-wing audience. Right-wing people are watching something else.
Mm-hmm. Every once in a while you slip up and I catch some of the things you say. And the other day you said you had an affinity for cults. Did you realize you had said that?
Yes, absolutely. I have a weakness for cults. Not that I've joined one whole hog, but I did Kundalini yoga for a couple of years. It has quite a bit of a cult status, and I'm a convert to Orthodox Judaism. For many people, Orthodox Judaism would be a cult.
Well, cult leaders would look at the Lucosphere as something that they could, I don't know, if they got a hold of you, they could just like mushroom it out there and just go crazy with it. So I don't know. It sounds like you're just a fan of the love bombing. What would you do? You'd let them do all the love bombing, and then you'd be like, psych, not interested, something like that.
Yeah, what happens is, I enjoy the love bombing, but very quickly, the skeptical side of me kicks in. So I think after a month of Kundalini yoga, I went and researched what are the bad parts of Kundalini yoga, and I read the stories of all sorts of people who feel like their lives were ruined by Kundalini yoga, and I also read many of the harshest critics of Judaism. I wanted to read negative perspectives on Jews and Judaism. Whenever I get enthusiastic about something, I always want to read the primary works of detractors.
Speaking of that, I was going to say, sometimes people do things not from a sense of economic gain or power, but from a sense of duty to express themselves. And Henry Ford, he was an accomplished industrialist. He had plenty of intellectual pursuits to, take up his 168 hours a week. But like Steve Saylor, like Luke Ford, like me, he was a noticer. And for some reason, he noticed peculiarities about the Jews. And I don't know, have you ever looked into the writings he had put into the Dearborn whatever? Have you ever taken it?
Yeah. And I do think that Jews benefit from accurate critique just as much as any other group, and that Jews have their weaknesses, certainly just like any other group. But I don't think that Henry Ford's material that he's publishing is a good example of thoughtful, accurate critique. So he came to regret that many of the things that he published. But as far as the overall philosophical perspective of let's understand Jews as we understand blacks and we understand Presbyterians, and how do they affect themselves, the people around them, wider society, what are their strengths and weaknesses, which industries, which parts of America tend to be particularly influenced by Jews or any other group, which parts tend to have very little Jewish influence. Yeah, I think that's a valid basis for scholarship. It's just that what Henry Ford published didn't usually stand up particularly well on the basis of truth. But on the other hand, this truthful analysis of different groups is so highly charged and is so controversial and dangerous that it tends to only attract antisocial people who don't tend to be particularly well-balanced, right? The well-balanced person doesn't usually run into machine gun fire. And Henry Ford deliberately ran into machine gun fire by publishing the things that he published about Jews. So
yeah, that's why I figured I'd ask you, because basically I've only dipped my toes into it for about 45 minutes, and it seems kind of boring. He's talking about the way when the Jews entered the whiskey business, they were quick to really blend it all up, and no longer was it a product that took 7, 8, 9 years to put together, and that all of a sudden now you didn't really know what you were getting or whatever. So I mean, I have just really dipped my toes in it, but I thought, let me ask Luke, because some people will say, and they're out there, people that say you shouldn't even study this. Where I figure I would ask you, Luke, why wouldn't I take a look at this and just say, I've got the perspective of 103 more years of history than Henry Ford had, so maybe I should check into it, and then Luke and I could ask questions, see what we agreed or disagreed down the road. You don't see any problem with doing that, do you, Luke?
absolutely not. The pursuit of truth is a noble pursuit, doesn't mean that it would be socially advantageous for you to share about what you've been learning, studying the publications of Henry Ford in just any social setting. So,
well, yeah, but the truth is, if they had more intellectual pursuits for people like Luke and Kip on the YouTube, I wouldn't have to go down those top rabbit holes, would I?
exactly.
That's the truth. All right. Thanks, Luke. I appreciate you indulging me, sir. All right.
You're
bye-bye.
welcome. You're welcome. Bye-bye. So the life and work of Henry Ford certainly worth reading about and understanding in its context and reading critiques of it. I'm sure there's a tremendous amount to be learned. So what the hell's going on with this story? I don't understand.
But first, breaking tonight, not far from here in New York, residents and government officials are demanding answers tonight about the mysterious drone sightings that have been going on for nearly a month. No one seems to be sharing much information at all. In fact, many officials are saying they don't know much at all. But one Republican congressman insists one of America's adversaries may be involved. The Pentagon is pushing back. Correspondent Nate Foy is live tonight in Ewing Township, New Jersey, with the latest on what is a big mystery and potentially a dangerous one we don't know. Good evening, Nate.
Good evening, Brett. So Congressman Jeff Van Drew of New Jersey claimed today that last month Iran launched a so-called drone mothership, and he said that it's sitting off the east coast of the United States. But hours later, the Pentagon came out and said that's not true.
There is not any truth to that. There is no Iranian ship off the coast of the United States.
The Pentagon is refuting claims by Congressman Jeff Van Drew that Iran may be responsible for mysterious drones flying over New Jersey and New York.
These are not U.S. military drones. What our initial assessment here is that these are not drones or activities coming from a foreign entity or adversary.
We've got to bring them down, and we've got to find a way to bring them down.
The U.S. Northern Command tells Fox News it's monitoring the reports of unauthorized drone flights in the vicinity of military installations in New Jersey. But, quote, at this time, we have not been requested to assist with these events. After more than 3 weeks of nightly drone sightings, New Jersey Congressman Chris Smith's office wrote a letter to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, reading in part, quote, I urgently request all capabilities possessed by the Department of Defense. In New Jersey, state legislators and mayors received a briefing from state police, but got no answers.
The briefing I just sat through was a disgrace. It was an insult to our legislatures, and I've never been through a more amateur hour briefing in my entire life.
Governor Phil Murphy didn't attend the meeting after his office requested it.
The governor is not inside. Where are you, Phil Murphy? This is ridiculous.
The concern grows stronger by the day, along with disbelief and skepticism.
While I appreciate the effort done by the state police and Homeland Security, the FBI is the one that's supposed to be leading this investigation, and they are MIA at today's briefing.
According to several people who attended those two briefings today, authorities in New Jersey are investigating between 4 and 180 drone sightings on a nightly basis, and they're having a hard time picking up on the drones' frequencies, which is making them even more difficult to locate. Brett?
Nate Foy, thank you.
Northern New Jersey is being invaded by drones, and it's either a combination of incompetence or I don't even want to think what it could be.
These drones should be shot down, whether it was some crazy hobbyist that we can't imagine or whether it is.
Okay, so will reading the publications of Henry Ford or Adolf Hitler or Karl Marx or the Unabomber, will they drive you mad? No. If you're sane, there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to read any book. If you're insane, then anything can set you off to do damage. So I stand on the almost free speech side of things, just almost total commitment to free speech, free inquiry. There's no reason you should not be curious about Jews and Jewish influence and blacks and black influence and Christian influence and Iranians and Iranian influence, and why does it seem like different groups have different gifts. And if you optimize for truth, then you're going to be much less likely to get into trouble as opposed to simply optimizing for that which gives you certain feelings of that you're special, that you really understand the way things work. They don't do this to me, right? I understand the ways of the world. They can't trick me. And so if you're using your studies of these forbidden topics to try to shore up your sense of yourself as a special snowflake with brilliant insights that other people just aren't wise enough to hold on to, right? If you don't have a pathology that is driving your investigation, then you optimize for truth, you use good discretion with whom you discuss it, and off you go. Optimizing for truth is a wonderful pursuit.
Thank you to ZocDoc for sponsoring a portion of today's video. It says conspirators, hidden plans, and malintent. So the definition of conspiracy theory that I'm operating on in this video makes no evaluative judgment about whether conspiracy theories are true or not. Based on the definition, even conspiracy theorists themselves would probably say that, yeah, I believe in a conspiracy theory. And let's be real, some conspiracy theories are real. There are lots of situations where, for instance, the elites abuse their power. Corporate greed has led to systemic consequences, and groups of people have been scapegoated, such as the medical experimentation on Black Americans that was very common in the 20th century. So my intention with this video is not to comment on this conspiracy theory is real versus this one is rubbish, but rather to present you with the research on why.
Right. So why are you studying something? Is it to show that you are braver and superior to everyone else? Or are you primarily devoted to truth?
Why do people believe in conspiracy theories? What are their motivations? And who tends to believe in conspiracy theories? Are there certain psychopathologies, personality disorders, or just personality traits associated with a belief in conspiracy theories?
So in traditional Judaism, you are discouraged from studying Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, till you're age 40. That you have been observant of Jewish law for a long time. You're at least age 40, you're married and you have kids. And then if you want to go and study esoteric matters, then go do it. But I know people who were in the late 30s that were married, had kids, had a great job, studied some esoteric materials, and they lost their mind. So not everyone is cut out for studying certain things. Right, there are things that can predispose someone with mental weaknesses to go down a bad path. But the most important thing for the quality of your life is the quality of your relationships, right? If you are in good with your family and your friends and your community, you're highly unlikely to go down a dark path from reading a book.
Before I break it down in this video, I'd love to hear your initial thoughts in the comments below without the video. Back to conspiracy theorists. So the research shows that conspiracy theories are caused by three main motives: a need to understand one's environment, which are called epistemic motives, a need to feel secure in one's environment, which are called existential motives, and a need to maintain a superior.
So a need to understand your environment. If that will help you make better choices, that's an adaptive desire. If it's not going to help you make better choices, then it doesn't serve you. A need to feel secure and safe in one's environment. If your environment is insecure and unsafe, trying to make yourself feel safe and secure in an unsafe and insecure environment is a maladaptive strategy. And a need to maintain a superior but fragile image of yourself and your in-group, that shows a pathology.
Superior image in oneself and one's in-group, which are called social motives. How so? So a need to understand one's environment. Let's say a monumental event like 9/11 happens or the COVID-19 pandemic, and you just need to make meaning of it. It can't just be random. There must be an explanation that you can formulate in your head. What about a need to feel secure in your environment? If you feel disenfranchised by society, if you've lost your identity for whatever reason, then you're going to mistrust the people that are supposed to keep you safe, the people in power, the politicians, the lawmakers, all of that. And what about that third need of trying to maintain a superior image of yourself and your in-group? If you believe that some identity you hold, whether it's American, male, Christian, Muslim, white, black, whatever it is superior to others, and you see everyone not within your group as a threat to your social identity, you're going to idealize your group and you're going to blame the out-group for anything.
And there will be times where this is adaptive, right? If your group is fighting for its life, fighting for its survival, having an intense in-group identity and intense negative feelings about out-groups is likely to be adaptive. But in the United States today, this will overwhelmingly be a maladaptive strategy for life.
anything that goes wrong. And we know from the research that conspiracy theories tend to appeal more to people who find their in-group's identity to be threatened. For example, those with lower status due to income or ethnicity tend to be more drawn to conspiracy theories, or those on the losing side of political processes might also feel
Right. Overwhelmingly, conspiracy theories in the colloquial sense that we use conspiracy theory as in some wacky theory that is being pretty effectively debunked by those in the know, right? Overwhelmingly, conspiracy theories are only subscribed to by losers, people who are winning at life, people who are making a great deal of money, people who are successful and happy. They don't need to buy into bogus theories of how the world is the way it is. Now, literally, a conspiracy theory is happening all the time, meaning one person conspires with someone else to get something done. But the way conspiracy theory is used in public parlance is for some wacky belief that cuts against what we know, that goes against the strongest evidence that we have.
Disenfranchised in that way. So when any of these three needs are deprived, what you get is an individual who's tempted to believe in conspiracy theories. Now, the same meta-analysis that I was talking about before found that the social motives are particularly supported by the research. So it seems the conspiracy theorists tend to rely quite heavily on individual and collective narcissism. Why individual narcissism? Well, like one of the articles I looked at mentioned, people who endorse conspiracy theories are motivated to stand out among their peers and feel entitled to special recognition. That is basically what narcissism is. If you feel like there's this secret truth that nobody but me knows, but I'm so clever that I've figured it out, then you're going to feel superior to other people, and it's going to fuel that narcissism. Conspiracy theories.
Well, why would you need to feel superior to other people? Overwhelmingly because you're losing at life, and so you need to make up and invent a reason for why, by all objective measures, you're losing at life. By this made-up measure, you're really the true winner. You're the true brave person. You're the one with the clarity and the courage to just look reality in the face. And so it's a way to cover up for your own, vulnerability. All right, I want to get back to this Ronnie Goldman essay in progress on the twin pathologies of fat acceptance and anti-COVID conspiracism. And so he notes each movement is at once more and less extreme than the other, depending upon the framework. So fat acceptance ideology is certainly conspiratorial, but it doesn't have the grand conspiracy of the anti-vaccine crowd. Now, right-wing populists, with their more basic sensibilities, see the machinations of hidden actors, while progressives are more likely to detect only the subtle yet pernicious influence of structural forces, so that makes them, by that comparison, less conspiratorial. So falsifying the results of a vaccine safety testing would be a bona fide conspiracy, whereas doctors saying you shouldn't be fat, this will be explained by people on the left as a subtle bias pervading the ambient culture. There's no need to theorize any outlandishly improbable machinations transpiring behind some veil of illusion. So people fighting for fat acceptance are usually among the more successful people in society. They usually have elite levels of education, and their arguments are quite high IQ, right? You have to be extremely smart to propound something so stupid. Anti-vaccine conspiracy theorizing doesn't require a high IQ. So if you want to expose the health establishment and doctors as part of some kind of negative, pernicious social construct, and therefore it's a repressive part of capitalism and our patriarchal society to make women feel bad about eating to their level of satisfaction. All right, that's kind of a cartoonish conspiracy. But is it more cartoonish than that found among anti-vax conspiracists who think that when you get the vaccine that you're being implanted with mind control? So both worldviews, the fat acceptance worldview and the anti-vax worldview, are delusional, but the components of the delusion vary, right? So the literal delusions of many anti-vaxxers bear far greater resemblance to what you find in paranoid schizophrenics. So many right-wing anti-vaxxers spout genuine conspiracy theories, while the fat acceptance crowd just spouts postmodern pablum. So anti-vaxxers are less extreme than many fat activists, in that they don't contest the legitimacy of health itself as a concept and a reality and something that's natural, normal, and good. They just merely object that vaccines don't promote this common value of health. So even at their most outlandish, anti-vaccine conspiracists do not seek to deny common sense, taken for granted values of good health. So unlike fat activists, the anti-vaxxers don't impugn people's desire to present themselves and to indeed experience themselves as well, healthy, able-bodied, and full of vitality. So fat activism requires logical contortions of overwrought critical theory speak to make their case, right? Anti-vaxxers can just speak viscerally off the cuff about elites who wish them ill. So the quackery of the right anti-vaxxers is reactive, it's plain, and it's primitive, and it has a sort of unreflective sincerity. And the quackery of the fat acceptance crowd on the left is subtle and calculated to obfuscate. It tends to be driven by self-delusion and false consciousness. So the left-wing fat acceptance argument is much more sophisticated and will tend to elicit hatred and a desire for vengeance from the right, while the pathologies of the right, such as anti-vax thinking, will elicit contempt, or meaning looking down from the left, because the anti-vaxxers tend to be lower in socioeconomic status than those pushing for fat acceptance.
Are also linked to a need for uniqueness and a distrust of others. You feel like, wow, I'm so special compared to other people, and also I can't trust other people. Of course, you're going to be drawn to conspiracy theories. Also, if you feel victimized in the world, you're going to be drawn to conspiracy theories. And who feels victimized in the world better than a narcissist? And why collective narcissism? Why is that associated with conspiracy theories? Collective narcissism is the belief that your in-group is superior to other groups and other people don't appreciate it enough. It's the difference between saying, I love America, and America is number one. One of them is just saying, I love the in-group that I belong to, while the other one is saying my in-group is superior to other groups. And interestingly, studies show that non-narcissistic in-group positivity doesn't lead to conspiracy theories. So if you think, I love our group, but it's not because we're better than other groups, that actually protects you against conspiracy theories. You're not going to believe in conspiracy theories if that's the kind of healthy positivity in your groups that you hold. Now, what about those epistemic motives that I talked about? How do conspiracy theories help conspiracy theorists try to make sense of their environment? Well, conspiracy theories tend to have a reduced tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. So if there's something that has like contradicting information, that doesn't sit right with them. They need that cognitive closure, or else they don't know what to do with the cognitive dissonance. They also tend to find meaning in random, unrelated events, and they also over-rely on intuition. Now, intuition can be very valuable, but if you over-rely on it at the expense of other forms of information gathering, then that can lead to some problematic conclusions that you draw. Conspiracy theories are also pretty resistant to falsification. If someone is hiding the truth from the masses, then you can neither disprove nor prove the theory, right? So there's not really anything that you can do to argue with a person like that. Conspiracy theorists also tend to discard huge bodies of research. For example, there are some people that still to this day maintain that vaccines cause autism when there is not an ounce of scientific truth to this. And they also have something called patternicity, which is a heightened ability to see patterns in many places. Belief in conspiracy.
Right. If the pattern is there, then seeing patterns is a beautiful thing. If the pattern is not there, then it's a delusion. So let's talk about pathology. I'm on the right. It's easier for me to see pathology on the left than it is to see it on my own side. Pathology means sickness, illness, not working as it should. So I have a pathological condition in my wrist if my wrist is not able to do all the things that you would expect your wrist to do. To the best of my knowledge, every part of my body does everything that you would expect it to do. Right? When I walk, my foot rolls on the ground. My ankles have considerable flexibility. I don't have any pain. So to the best of my knowledge, my body works as it should. Now, what is a mental health pathology? That's when your mental health system is not working as it should. So, for example, if by doing this live stream, I am costing myself a chance at lasting love, marriage, children, financial success, communal love and status, and so just by spouting all these opinions that I share on this YouTube video, I am destroying the quality of the rest of my life, then what I'm engaged in right now would be pathological. But I am unaware of having paid any significant price for my live streams over the past 6 years, except, of course, that the time and energy that I devote to them could have been devoted to something else that would have made more money. So when I think about pathologies on the right and left, right? So on the right, I would think the instinctive contempt and instinctive skepticism with regard to expertise and experts, that is maladaptive and sometimes pathological. So the idea that common sense is always superior to an academic study, I think that is pathological. Would you want someone building a skyscraper just based on common sense, or would you want them engaging in highly regulated, soundly sourced program and a design, and the building should be approved by regulators, and you should have experienced people who are designing it and building it, all right? You wouldn't just want to rely on common sense when it comes to building a skyscraper. If you've got bleeding in the brain, you wouldn't want someone cutting into your brain just using common sense. You would want them to have as much expertise as possible. So on the right, there is often undue skepticism and disdain for expertise, which sometimes verges on the pathological, such as with regard to getting vaccinated. Now, it's a lot easier for me to see the pathologies on the left. So denying that different groups have different gifts is a denial of an obvious truth. Believing in blank slate, that we were born essentially with a blank slate, is an obvious disregard of the truth. And denying how the world works and denying these obvious truths strikes me as pathological. Denying that mentally ill people are not at a much higher risk to you of hurting you or committing some physical act of violence, even murder, right? Mentally ill people are much more likely to hurt you than non-mentally ill people. So the denial of significant differences between men and women, right, is an obvious denial of reality to me. That strikes me as pathological. The notion that you can have gays and women and straight men all working together in the same foxhole in a fight, and that there won't be a decrease in social cohesion and social trust when you thrust all that diversity into one foxhole, going into war, going into combat, I think is a delusion on the left. The more you have in common with other people, the more secure you'll feel, the more you'll be willing to sacrifice, and the more cohesive and effective your unit will be. So there's one argument here. Anti-vaccine ideologies, on the one hand, you could say are more pernicious than the fat acceptance crowd because they don't ask us to transcend common sense. So they can draw a lot more converts than the fat acceptance crowd. And you can see the body count comparing excess death rates among Republican Democratic voters during COVID, which is largely a reflection of different vaccination rates. So Republicans have been far more likely to die from COVID, all other things being held equal due to much lower rates of vaccination. So I would describe that as a pathology. Right? There's no fat acceptance influencer with the prominence of, say, an anti-vaxxer RFK Jr., who's now been nominated to head the Department of Health and Human Services. Even assuming every medical intervention undertaken in the name of gender identity was a mistake, the damage done would be a blip compared to that threatened by the forces of climate change denialism if the conventional wisdom is correct. So the left asks people to repudiate conventional notions of self and identity. The right asks people to accept certain causal connections and to deny others, none of which are immediately apparent. So liberals have far greater tolerance for fat acceptance. In fact, activists' grievances are understandable, particularly from a liberal perspective, and much more socially acceptable among liberals to be for fat acceptance rather than to be anti-vax. So the fat acceptance crowd does not argue on the basis of obesity is a disability. They argue on the basis that fatness is an identity that should be respected. And fat activists claim that they are intersectional victims of multiple interlocking systems of oppression. Now, where is the oppression of anti-vaccine identities? Well, how about the thousands of people who've been fired from their jobs because they didn't get vaccinated, and the tens of thousands of people who could not land jobs or participate in public life because they were not vaccinated? Now, Ronnie Goodman argues progressives should resist the temptation to hold anti-vaxxers in contempt while giving the fat acceptance crowd a pass, because both the fat acceptance movement and the anti-vax movement are in a sense mirror images of each other. Right? Anti-vaxxers will say, why are we stigmatized by liberal elites for doubting the safety and efficacy of newly minted vaccines when fat activists are permitted to impugn the reigning medical consensus for decades, if not centuries? So ordinary Americans will see the noble lives of progressives as a moral warrant for their own denial of vaccine effectiveness. Progressives hold themselves out as champions of reason and enlightenment, but they will still have considerable sympathy for the fat acceptance crowd. And this kind of left-wing disingenuousness will only solidify hatred for the left and for the elites on the part of ordinary middle Americans. So if you indulge the fat acceptance crowd, that threatens the values of common sense and health that help unite a country. So when the left just nihilistically celebrates decadence when it's A-OK with the fat acceptance crowd, that will tend to validate the right wing's judgment that the left is nihilistically celebrating decadence. Right? Progressives claim that their universal values call on them to unearth the universal principles that are running beneath our differences. So that should mean endeavoring to understand anti-vaxxers as no less the victims of circumstances than the fat acceptance activists. So the liberal view of ordinary Americans mirrors many people's moralistic misconceptions about fat people. So we are genetically evolved as highly social and interdependent primates. We all have moral taste buds. Different cultures cultivate our moral taste buds in different ways to different degrees. So some of our moral taste buds, such as our instinct for harm avoidance or resistance to domineering authority, rest on secular foundations, while other moral taste buds, such as the commitment to purity, hating contagion, the experience of the sacred, are based in a religious foundation. But they can yield considerable secular benefits. So today's culture wars, Jonathan Haidt theorizes, can be explained by how different American subcultures have developed their moral taste buds to the relative or absolute exclusion of others. So if America seems divided between mutually incomprehensible foreign tribes, one reason is that we have developed widely divergent moral palettes, right? We no longer possess the same overlapping moral intuitions to even listen to one another. Whew. That Ronnie Goodman, quite the philosopher.
Just baseline.
Well, that is the correct answer.
It's a very how did we go? How did we go from
bougie of you,
that's very
Christine,
simplistic.
How did we go from teach men not to rape to not also teach men not to murder healthcare?
Right. But so what happens when you have evidence that a society may be in the nascent stages of spiraling out of control? And remember how easily America took to the crime wave. The crime wave, America was a country with very little crime until 1963. By 1973, the crime rate had tripled in the United States. And the general attitude was, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I mean, look, it's thin red line. And, now that they're doing it, we don't know how to stop it. Supreme Court has made all these rulings that seem to privilege the rights of the accused over the rights of victims, the 911 policing. What are you going to do? Everybody kind of accepted it and then had to make a decision about how to live by voting with their feet, by moving away from places where crime was, rather than saying criminals can't take over our streets, our cities, our place. That is not what a civilized society does. It is that idea that is best typified by George Orwell's immortal statement that there are some ideas so stupid only an intellectual can believe them. This is the paramount version of that, which is you see a society hurtling toward a kind of anarchism, or of lack of faith in its own institutions and a lack of belief in its own efforts to maintain order. And what you see is an intellectualization of something that should not be intellectualized, which is, what is the primary purpose of a society? It is to protect people from random acts of violence, theft, and murder. Someone's not allowed to come into your house and rape your daughter. Someone can't take your gold from your drawer. Someone can't just come up to you and cut off your arm. We come together in a general compact that says, you don't do that to him, he doesn't do it to you, and we can all kind of go on day to day, not living in a defensive crouch, assuming that the next person who walks down the block is going to kill us.
So there's a related essay in Compact magazine by Jeff Schallenberger. It's called The Antipsychiatry Movement's Long Shadow. So Jordan Neely died when he was ranting about killing people, and Daniel Penny grabbed him and inadvertently strangled him. So Jordan Neely died in a Manhattan subway car last year, just 2 weeks after the release of a book that was quite relevant. Jonathan Rosen's The Best Minds, A Story of Friendship, Madness, and the Tragedy of Good Intentions. Right? We naturally fear people who are mentally ill, and we naturally fear people who are mentally ill for very good reasons, because they are dangerous. So this Jonathan Rosen book is about his childhood best friend, an intellectual prodigy, who became a paranoid, full-on schizophrenic, and ended up murdering his pregnant fiancée in 1998. Right? Schizophrenic people are 100 times more likely to murder you than non-mentally ill people. Right? Schizophrenic people are incredibly dangerous. So what should society do with those suffering from a severe psychosis that renders them far more likely to hurt innocent people than your normal person? Right? Why not forcibly confine them, both for their own safety and for the safety of others? Right? Surely it is undesirable to have people like Neely, severely mentally ill, drug addicted, a menace, to be a constant public presence on public transport and in our cities. It's undesirable to have to rely on citizen intervention such as that demonstrated by Daniel Penny to try to maintain some basic public order. And the death of Neely was regrettable, but it was a symptom of a profound dysfunction in our society. We are allowing dangerous mentally ill people to ruin our public spaces, particularly in cities. And progressives, people on the left, dodge this question. They consistently claim that the mentally ill are not more of a threat to us when they clearly are. Right? Jordan Neely, he lacked shelter and treatment not because society had failed to provide it. He left the treatment facility in the Bronx, where after being tried for assault, he was sent by a judge and a prosecutor, right? All in line of the restorative justice that lefties advocate. Right? So the state had provided Neely with shelter and with treatment, and also gave him the freedom to refuse these things. Right? The provision of basic resources would not have saved him. He would not allow himself to stay in treatment. Right? He was better off in jail than on the streets. Only locking him up could have saved him. So the protagonist in the Jonathan Rosen story grew up in a happy middle-class family. He was academically successful, and then his mental illness began in his 20s, and he ended up murdering someone. So between the 1960s and 1980s, America ended the mass involuntary confinement of the mentally ill in state institutions, and as a consequence, destroyed the quality of much of public life. But we need government. We need government to involuntarily confine people who are dangerous. So they stop ruining public transport and public spaces. So allowing the severely mentally ill back onto the streets, right? We are disrupting any quality of life on the part of those who have to interact with them. And for those who say, oh, mental illness, it's just a social construct, it's just a means of stigmatizing and excluding people who are merely different. Well, think about the wrist example. All right, my wrist does everything you want my wrist to do. My psyche, my mental health does pretty much everything I would want my mental health to do. So I try to attune to people that I'm around. I try to only speak when that is appropriate. I stop speaking when the cessation of speech is more appropriate. I try to attune the things that I say to the person that I'm talking to. I get sad when I suffer defeats. I get happy when I build things successfully. Right? When I suffer setback after humiliation, I usually pause and stop and rethink how I'm doing things. And so that's an adaptive response to humiliation. So mental health is just like wrist health, right? Does it function to serve you so that I want to be able to do everything that a wrist should allow me to do. And my mental health should allow me to have all the interactions and all of the life that a normal, healthy person can participate in. So we used to have this notion, thanks to movies such as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that mental health workers and psychiatrists, they were just some kind of sadistic enforcers of social norms. But more and more people have turned to them for help in managing stress and depression. And now when we see the results of just allowing the mentally ill to take over our public spaces in our big cities, maybe returning them to insane asylums is the best way to go. So during the COVID era, people on the left were in this strange position. They argued the state must not forcibly confine and medicate the Jordan Neelys of the world, but it should exclude the unvaccinated from public life. Conservatives have mostly claimed the reverse. Right? The Jordan Neelys need to be confined.
That's literally the foundations of our society. But liberal opinion, and I now use the word liberal from the 19th century onward because I'm about to quote something in relation to this. Liberal opinion loves to abstract and try to come up with complex ways in which that raw, naked fact about the idea that societies exist to provide order for everyone in them is heartless or not an understanding of the true workings of things. And I want to quote from a brilliant essay that we published in commentary by Gary Saul Morson, the professor of Russian literature at Northwestern, about Dostoevsky's novel, The Demons or the Possessed or the Devils, however you want to translate it. And this is the greatest political novel ever written, he says, and I think that's probably pretty much an accepted opinion. And it is about a terrorist cell in Russia in the early 1870s that kind of takes over a provincial town and is largely composed of the town's pretentious, intellectual bourgeois elite who are harnessed into becoming a terrorist cell by a charismatic intellectual leader. And what's important is not the terrorist cell, though that is important. But here is what Morson says in his essay. It is telling that Dostoevsky directs his most savage attacks in The Devils, not at the radicals, but at the liberals who fawn on them.
So pretty shocking news that celebrity Jay-Z, the celebrity rapper, has been named in a civil suit along with P Diddy as raping a 13-year-old girl. So how could such an upstanding citizen such as Jay-Z be sued like this? So looking through Jay-Z's Wikipedia page, apparently he shot his own brother in the shoulder. Didn't graduate from high school, dropped out in his sophomore year to sell crack cocaine. Claims he was shot 3 times during this period. And and then he shot his own brother for allegedly stealing his jewelry. So I don't find it shocking that Jay-Z and P Diddy did pretty much all the things that they've been accused of. Rappers tend to have a really terrible track record.
Here, too, he proved prophetic. In the years leading to the Bolshevik takeover, the liberal Russian party known as the Cadets, the Constitutional Democrats, refused to condemn terrorism and other violence completely at odds with their own professed values, as long as the barbarities came from parties to their left. They, the Cadets, became the Bolsheviks' first victims. The lead terrorist in the Pyotr Stepanovich understands precisely what motivates such liberals. And here, Morrison quotes Dostoevsky. I could make them go through fire, Pyotr Stepanovich says. One has only to din it into them that they are not advanced enough. Supposedly rejecting all authority, these liberals are, quote, ashamed to have an opinion of their own. They favor the guillotine, explains one character, because it is easier to cut off heads than to think through an idea. Shatov, another character, calls their mindset flunkyism of thought. So what we have here is the idea that the villains aren't necessarily, the evildoers are the evildoers, and they are demons, as Dostoevsky calls them. This is a demonic force that has taken over. Dostoevsky was a deeply religious man, and he was not using the idea of demonic force metaphorically here. He believed it to be the case. But that this demonic force, absent this cadre of opinion that would back it up because of its supposedly enlightened framework.
So the NFL is not backing away from its association with Jay-Z. Seems like no corporation is backing away from its association with Jay-Z. I wonder if he didn't have special protective status, member of a victimized group, whether people would back away from associating with him. Seems like he's got a certain type of privilege, right? Normally, you get sued for gang raping a 13-year-old girl. Most businesses don't want to be associated with you. But for businesses in bed with Jay-Z, it's just another Wednesday.
Is what led inexorably in this book 30 years after Dostoevsky's own death to the Russian Revolution and the single most evil regime that the world has ever seen. And I want to overstate like what Mangione is shot a healthcare official, and I don't want to go too far. But I do want to say that when you see a tiny green shoot come out of a ground, fertile ground, like the 20-year anti-institutional feeling in the United States, the sense that we're not all in it together anymore, which I think we all understand, has now sort of left our political life, at least for the time being. That without that, everything is permitted, as Dostoevsky might say.
I agree with you, because obviously there is a thin veneer of civilization that protects us from the barbarians, and that never goes away. But I do think that we should observe what's unfolding here through the lens of the recent election. And I think that the election shows that Americans are willing to not let everything slide out of control, and have looked over the past 4 years where it did seem that criminality was increasing, that the rule of law meant very little, that kind of abnormality was being renormed, and said, no, stop. And so that's why I think I'm slightly more confident that here the antibodies will work as well. And that what we're seeing is either just deranged lefties whose voices are amplified on social media, or like with those TikTok Osama bin Laden videos from last year, some kind of foreign power trying to undermine the U.S. system from within.
I don't think in the 60s and 70s that there was any sense in the United States that the ideas that I'm talking about, the Kerner Commission ideas, the liberal jurisprudence adopted by the Supreme Court and federal courts all over the country, all of that any of that had common public purchase. In fact, you could say almost exactly the opposite was the case, that there was a kind of a vomitous revolt against all of it. That if you take Watergate out of the scenario in 1974, you would see an uninterrupted period from 1968 to 1992 in which the people who espoused those ideas only remained in power in Washington due to gerrymandering and a kind of entropic degradation.
The cultural rot is still there. Right.
But this is
we didn't
why
we didn't turn into this. We didn't have a Bolshevik revolution.
We didn't, exactly, because the American people wouldn't let that happen.
I'm saying that the American people are still
let it happen
the American
again.
people.
And this is why, to a point we were talking about the other day on the podcast, this is why Trump's remark about success could prove to be important, because his definition of success is rooting out some of these things, whether it be DEI, whether it be progressive prosecutors. And the irony of him being becoming a stand-in for rule of law obviously is noted. But that is, I think Matt's absolutely right. People are voting against this, and he doesn't actually have to be as radicalizing a force as he appeared to be in 2016 to do it. He just has to return to a mean that I think a lot of people want to return to.
I just want to point out on this Dostoevsky point about the liberal support network and the flunkyism of thought. What makes someone like John Fetterman great, and I do think he's great, it's not that he agrees with us on Israel. I'm very appreciative that he agrees with us on Israel. It's that he's not afraid of the radicals. It's that he doesn't demonstrate the flunkyism of thought, if I'm getting the quote correct. That's what makes him stand out. And the fact that he stands out because we don't see.
Okay, good discussion on Reason Roundtable about the death of the health insurance CEO.
It's impossible. So I guess I think every debate is about this, and it's sort of childish and frustrating that the way that this one has played out is for people to be like, yeah, get him, about this man who's just trying to run a profitable company that provides valuable services.
Two other things to just note very quickly are that health insurance companies tend to have very low profit margins, 5% or less, sometimes even quite a bit less than that, and they are legally required, in fact, to spend 80 or 85% of their total revenues on healthcare. So that effectively puts a profit ceiling. The other thing is here that what we're fundamentally talking about is trade-offs. And what people don't like is the idea that there are trade-offs in healthcare in every single system. And there's a big contingent, particularly on the left in the United States, that is devoted to the idea that there don't have to be trade-offs, and other countries don't have trade-offs. That is simply false. Every single country with any healthcare system that exists has trade-offs. I'm sorry, it's true. That's just the way the world works.
Nick, I'm old enough to remember when Barack Hussein Obama was giving State of the Union addresses, crowing, dunking the football, as they say in sports.
Sounds perfect.
Yep.
Nailed it.
Because he shouted down, he beat back the health insurance lobbyists in pushing through Obamacare, which, many really smart people like Ezra Klein pointed out that people will die if it doesn't get passed. And Elizabeth Warren in 2017, when Donald Trump was thinking about overturning it, pointed out that people will die if it gets changed in any way, shape, or form. Is it odd to you that people who presumably were cheering on the passage of healthcare are now cheering on the assassination of insurance company executives, given that Obama has already declared victory over them?
I haven't quite seen Elizabeth Warren's tweet saying, do it again, But to your point, one of the things that I find, first, let's just say that people who are like, yeah, you go guy, when somebody gets shot, in the morning on a street in Manhattan, they're fucked up. There is a part of the left, there's a version of this on the right that is losing everything. And they are just going to become more and more ridiculous and ugly and horrific versions of their true selves. And we're witnessing that. We've seen that in various kinds of, spasmodic episodes. And this is the latest on that. And, these are these are dead enders who will never become powerful. But, as they shrink, they're going to get just harder and harder, because this is the politics of purity and also of social media, kind of enthusiasm and out of control stupidity. One of the things that related to this is, whenever we're talking about healthcare, two things come up, for me that people never seem to think about. And the first is, why aren't doctors working for free? Like, why, when we talk about healthcare costs, Peter mentioned briefly the anesthesiologist stuff. It's like, doctors are never told, oh, well, you know what, you have to work for half as much money. We say, oh, insurance companies, you can make half as much money, or you shouldn't make any profits. Sometimes we'll say, patients, you shouldn't be so fat and you shouldn't go to the doctor all the time. But we don't even really do that. But doctors have really rigged the system so well that during the Obamacare discussions, nobody said, how do we 10x the number of healthcare providers? Because if you increase the supply of something, the cost of it will go down. That just never came up. And, the fact is that there hasn't been an increase in medical school, slots or in residency slots, commensurate with growth in population or anything like that. Doctors make a huge amount of money. They also structure a huge amount of who is able to provide medicine and medical assistance and things like that. And if we're going to have a conversation about healthcare, and we should, and health insurance, we ought to be talking about doctors.
Right. Interesting essay here. Sociologist Musa Al-Ghabi on woke.
When growing numbers of people who grew up expecting to be elites find that the visions that they had for their lives are just not going to materialize or seem like they're not going to materialize and so on, what they do is they try to indict the order, the social order that they think failed them, and they try to tear down some of the existing elites to make room for people like themselves. And you can definitely see social justice discourse being used in precisely this way. My civilization, which is like the structure and nature of reality and things like this. But then I had a twin brother, and he died in Afghanistan in 2010. And in the aftermath of that, before that, I had thought politics was kind of dumb. It was people getting distracted by the little things, and I was focused on the big things. But then as I was kind of working through this tragedy with my family, I came to realize that politics was kind of more important than I thought, and important in different ways than I thought. And so I shifted. I was already enrolled in a philosophy program at that point, in a couple that I got into. And so I chose to go to the one that was closest to my family. And I shifted my focus away from epistemology to away from metaphysics into applied social epistemology, which is with, at being at schools like Columbia, where people have, the students are very capable. But they're like athletes, and they're like arrows in a way where they have a kind of map, and everything is trying to slot it into that map, and they're very reserved, more reserved, because a lot seems to be at stake if they say the wrong thing or think like they're more guarded. Things are all more guarded, and kind of interactions are more.
Right. The more prestigious a position you're in society, and if you're in an elite institution such as Columbia University, the more careful you have to be about what you say, because the more precipitous will be your fall, and the more scrutinized will be your words. If you're a plumber, not many people are going to scrutinize your words.
And so there was a lot that and in fact, even humility. So like when I was teaching at University of Arizona, if you gave a student a C or something like that, a grade they didn't like, they would come up to you and say, "Hey, professor, I had really been hoping I would do better in the class than I'm doing. What can I do different in order to get my..." You give a Columbia student a C, they're like, "What's wrong with you? Such that you don't recognize my greatness. Let me involve all sorts of third parties in here to dispute my grade and get it raised, whether or not I produced high quality work." And 3 versions of symbolic capital. There's like academic capital, which is when you kind of lean on your credentials or on your association with like knowledge economy institutions to get other people to take your views more seriously than they otherwise would, or to defer to you. So I write for the New York Times. I have a PhD in sociology. I'm a professor at Stony Brook. I don't know why it was hard for me to know where I'm teaching right now. Okay. And then there's also political capital, which is when people defer to you and follow your agenda, subordinate their own desires to yours. Because they're convinced that they either have to or that it's in their interest to do so. So for instance, if you say like, "Do what I say, I'm the manager. You should do what I say because I'm the manager." That's an example of political capital. Or alternatively, if you've just cultivated a reputation as someone who knows what you're doing and gets things done, such that other people think that just kind of doing whatever you want is best for them too, that's political capital. And then finally, there's cultural capital, which is when people do what you want and defer to you because they think you're cool and interesting and sophisticated, and they want you to like them, or they want to ingratiate themselves with you, and they want they want to make you happy, and so on and so forth. And so Bourdieu argued that collectively these different forms of.
So I've noticed as I've gone through life, when I'm more successful, when let's say I was just on 60 Minutes, right? You have more social capital, as opposed to when you're going from failure to humiliation to failure, then people don't tend to listen to you very intently.
Symbolic capital help mark people as being kind of insiders or outsiders, geniuses or hacks, as people who are worth listening to and taking seriously, or as people that you can safely ignore and or even marginalize. And so I started thinking about, so Bourdieu himself also had kind of an unusual journey into the academy. And Bourdieu himself, a lot of his earlier, I had been arguing that whole cycle, actually, that people should take Trump's prospects more seriously, mostly in like screaming into a vacuum, basically. Like, not just in my head, though. I was publishing essays that whole year, like, hey, guys, I think you should take this more seriously. I don't think it's going to be a landslide, guys. I'm pretty sure Hillary has some significant vulnerabilities and Trump can probably win this thing. But, whatever.
Where were you publishing these essays? Were you publishing them as an academic, and how were they being received?
Yeah, I mean, I was publishing them as an academic, but I wasn't at Columbia, so people didn't care about what I had to say as much as they did after I became associated with Columbia. And in fact, this is one of the things that was that shocked me the most.
Right, this is how the world really works. Right, it's about your capital, your social capital, your prestige. Right, the institutions that you're associated with. It's not about the intrinsic veracity, the intrinsic truth of what and profundity of what you have to say. It's more about where are you slotted in life. Are you a winner in life? Then people take you more seriously.
Most about moving to Columbia was just how much flows from your association with these elite institutions. So before I was at Columbia, I would pitch things to the New York Times and stuff. I wouldn't even get a rejection. I was below a no thank you. It was, and then I moved to Columbia, and I started having the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on reach out to me cold, not me pitching things to them and them getting back to me, but them saying, hey, why don't you write for us? Please write for us. Here's the...
Because they knew you were you like a PhD student, or what were you doing? Okay. Cultural capital, like this is a perfect example, like somebody can open the door, make an introduction for you, that kind of thing. But are you saying they just like heard that there was the
Manhattan? It's purely just in virtue of being associated with this institution, all of a sudden I'm someone who's worth listening to, when before I wasn't even someone who was worth rejecting. Right. And that's a pretty wild transition. One I'm of course grateful for, but also that I find deeply disturbing and troubling.
Okay, so what were you noticing around?
Like, there's all this research that shows when you mix more affluent kids and kids from highly educated parents with kids from less educated and less affluent backgrounds, in a world where these people just did send their kids to the zone public school, it would be a game changer actually for a lot of the students who go to that school. At PS 165, it's like 70% Black and Hispanic, overwhelmingly people who are low income. Difference. The people who really benefit from going to these elite schools are people from non-elite backgrounds who get a whole bunch of cultural capital that they wouldn't have had, social networks that they wouldn't have had, things like this. But for more elite people of more elite backgrounds, they already, through a bunch of other means, have a lot of these connections. They have this cultural capital.
Disadvantaged background, and they end up getting channeled into an elite institution, for example, that they wouldn't have been otherwise, either through affirmative action or, DEI efforts, et cetera, that they actually do a lot worse than if they would have just gone to a state school. Like if you've got
Well, if they're not able to keep up with the work, all right, if they feel a tremendous gap between themselves and those who got into the institution on the basis of merit, right, they'll just have to feel hollow inside. I want to finish off this conversation about how do we have a more effective government. This is the Ezra Klein Show.
Right. It wasn't the power of the government yelling at you. It was, the liberals online, right? It was the public health authorities who were just tweeting, but who on the one hand were saying, everybody has to stay inside. We're locking down the economy, but definitely go protest for George Floyd because racism is a public health issue as well. I mean, for people who are already skeptical, that was a real shattering of any trust left. But the school lockdowns were another big piece of that. I was just interviewing Jared Polis for a column, the governor of Colorado. And one reason I think he had such a huge resounding reelection in 2022, he won by almost 20 points in a not easy year for Democrats. I mean, his win was no less impressive than what Ron DeSantis did in Florida to me. But also, I think one reason Colorado did not shift right very much this year, it was only a point or two, is Polis among Democrats was a very, he was a sort of libertarian adjacent Democratic governor, right? He wore a mask, he got vaccinated, he gave out good information, but he was much quicker to reopen Colorado, and he was much more respectful of the idea that individual liberty was one of the equities that needed to be weighed here. And he was telling me that, people still come up to him on the streets and thank him for the way that he managed the pandemic in Colorado. So that's a bit of a long take, but I do think of the pandemic as a space where there was a lot of repulsion of some of the people we now think of as representing the sort of institutionally skeptic side of this Democrats lost. And then a lot of that was cultural. It wasn't just the government. It was this sort of like allied network of institutions, and then a lot of people from those institutions wielding that authority online and in the public square.
I mean, I do think if I was thinking about people like Joe Rogan, and I can't admit that I listen to all 4,000 hours of podcasts that he records every year. But one thing I think both him and Musk clearly had in common was, first of all, the COVID closures really did affect Musk's core business. So he was, in fact, the subject of what he would reasonably think of as coercive authority. That also interacted with the trans issue, which I think was very important for both Rogan and for Musk. So it wasn't just the COVID part. And I think the other part, the thing that, again, it's important to remember how many of these things are all happening at the same time. The response to George Floyd, the at least temporary spike in crime, that all happens at the same time that we called the Great Awakening. One way to think of it, the Great Awakening, is it was also a moment of gigantic groupthink. There was an enormous social pressure against diverging from any of those quite exotic elite consensuses that had emerged in that period. And I do think that drove parts of the Democratic Party into not all the way where activists were, but too far toward them for what a majoritarian political institution should be. And again, that's another reason why I think this party really needs more durable internal factional conflict that can maintain a culture of disagreement, in part in order to keep the Democratic Party from getting too close to the rocks, which is part of what happened, I think, in 2020, 21, 22.
I was reminded yesterday that the other thing that pushed Musk right after the things that were just mentioned was not being invited to the EV summit by Biden. And that was described to me as the thing that pushed him over. And it's tied together, right? I have no idea why they didn't invite him, but clearly he was no longer in the tribe.
Does that reflect, Jen, something broader, though, in the way Democratic culture, including policymaking culture, operated in this period? Which was, on the one hand, it was very allergic, has been extremely allergic to dissension within the coalition. If you are inside the tent, they want you on board, right? All the way, Bernie Sanders all the way and away to Liz Cheney. But if you're not, if you're culturally outside the tent, then you're really gone. Things operated not through disagreement and argument, but marginalization and ostracism. You could feel this happening. There was incredible management of the broad spectrum of liberals, right? And I think it's one reason Joe Biden in many ways was a very popular president, even, very late in the game among sort of Washington Democratic types. He never disappointed them until maybe Gaza. He really worked very hard to keep every part of it on board. But the going into spaces where you didn't like the people, that kind of fell off, in part because there was this backlash, right? There was backlash to Bernie Sanders going on Rogan years ago, right? There was a view that you should gatekeep, that there were certain voices that should not be elevated in the public discourse. It was platforming them, right? Every time I have people on the right on, I get emails that I'm platforming them. And I was going to say, there's nobody who comes on the show who doesn't have a platform. And the idea that the question is whether or not you give people a stage to stand on rather than whether or not you are talking to them, right? It misses that there is an exchange happening here. How do you think about the relationship to disagreement and conflict among Democrats?
I'm not in Democratic politics. I am on the policy and implementation side of it. So I see the tendencies that you're talking about from the struggles of public servants to implement things like the CHIPS Act, which famously, and you've written about this, has a lot in there for all the different groups. and the ways in which they are working 20 hours a day. And yet, what was it, 2 years after those bills, we had 17% of the dollars out the door. And I think what we miss is that there are already a bunch of requirements that when we're throwing all that stuff in a bucket and calling it a bill, we're not even thinking about. So you have companies applying for grants for projects that are already in process, which was smart. You don't want them to just stop and wait for the money. But then they have to go tell the companies, by the way, in addition to all the things we needed you to talk about in your grant application to cover all these liberal checkboxes, you also need to comply with the Davis-Bacon Act, which is going to be thousands of hours of work. You've got them complaining about things that are still around, like the Paperwork Reduction Act. And I think it's not just that tendency to say yes to everybody, but also not to go clear out some of the requirements that already exist and really interrogate the burden of administering these programs, the full burden that has come from that sort of accretion or, barnacles on the ship.
Yeah, there were two things in what Ezra said earlier that I think are worth taking note of. One is this point about the groups, which Ezra discussed with my old friend Mike Lind on a previous podcast, that part of the problem with the Democratic Party is that liberalism has a lot of what in other work I've called advocacy organizations rather than representative organizations. That is, they're groups that claim to speak for populations that they themselves have not mobilized or organized. And that part of the coalitional etiquette of the Democratic Party is not really questioning the basis of many groups to speak for the groups that they're claiming to speak for. And I think that's one part of it. And I also think that Ezra was talking about how previous Democratic presidents had more of an instinct to at least punch around a bit of their own coalition. The sister soldier thing is obvious with Bill Clinton, but I think we forget how much Barack Obama was an incredibly strong supporter of education reform, and I think he believed in it. The people he trusted believed in it, but I think he was entirely aware that the getting in fights with teachers' unions was a good look for him. Whereas Biden, especially because of the sort of treaty he had to do with Sanders and Warren, was part of that treaty effectively was not doing any of that, even though the Democratic Party desperately needed to send some signals that teachers unions, needed to go back to work right in the beginning of 2021, which they weren't able to do, and that crime in especially Democratic cities, that they needed to do something about it and pass a bill immediately. It was criminal political malpractice not to push for a significant policing and other kind of reforms in the beginning of 2021 that would have given additional resources and that at least would have sent the signal that Democrats took these things seriously and they weren't engaging in a kind of self-censorship and not see what lots of ordinary voters saw.
One thing you've said, Jen, is that you think the Democrats need to be prioritizing what you've called I-95-ness.
Yeah.
I think that might be a nice place to end here. What is I-95-ness?
It's the ability to say, we've got to get this thing done, as Josh Shapiro did when I-95 collapsed. And he said, even though there are all sorts of barriers to getting this roadway open again, we're going to suspend those barriers and make this happen. And you can see in the election, results, there's so much enthusiasm, I think, for that kind of leadership. Obviously, he's a Democratic governor. But yeah, it takes a lot of backbone. A lot of people pointed out that he did not suspend every rule to make that happen. He did it with union labor, but he chose which ones he would suspend. And it only took them days to get I-95.
Okay, how's that CHIPS Act working out? Good little report here from John Stossel, how DEI has destroyed the effectiveness of the CHIPS Act.
10 senators from both parties visibly happy to announce agreement.
3 years ago, Republicans and Democrats grabbed your money, promising
to build thousands of miles of fiber optic
cable that would provide high-speed internet to all of America.
$65 billion broadband push.
3 years later, no one's been connected. Not a single project is underway. Why? Because governments aren't good at building anything. As Milton Friedman put it,
very few people spend other people's money as carefully as they spend their own.
Politicians spending other people's money wasted it. Private companies laid miles of cable Well, government officials obsessed about giving broadband to the right people.
Boys, girls, people of color, people living in rural America.
Aging individuals, prisoners, LGBTQ persons. Any company that wants funds to build broadband has to hire certain people.
You have to hire these certain people based on their color, based on their sex, and you have to use unions.
Matt Cole's investment company researched the government's funding and made this ad.
What am I looking at here? Oh, there's nothing more important than making sure you're representing all the right causes.
You have all these companies that could actually do this, and I say, this is unimplementable with the restrictions, so they just walk away.
Eventually, government will probably succeed at installing some broadband. But by then, this hard-to-install cable may be totally unnecessary because of satellite internet like Starlink. Starlink already exists and costs much less.
They could do it literally today. You could have devices in these people's homes within the next couple months, and they could have high-speed internet access.
So why didn't administration officials do that? They said Starlink failed to demonstrate it had the ability. Then, once it became clear that Starlink obviously did, the administration said it won't use Starlink because it's a monopoly.
So first, they're not functional. Now they have a monopoly. The reality is that they didn't want that to be the solution.
They don't want to give money to Elon Musk.
Take over, Elon, just take over.
But now, Musk has a friend in government, so things may change. But that's not a good way to spend your money. Politicians doling it out to their friends. In fact, politicians have a bad track record when they decide what to build. They pumped billions into high-speed rail. 15 years later, we still don't have it. They lost $500 million on Solyndra, almost $1 billion trying to create synthetic fuels. More recently, a Biden meatpacking scheme starved 1 million chickens. And although Biden promised government would build
500,000 charging stations.
2 years later, how many have they built for $7 billion? 7. And again, government's failure at building things is not just a Democrat thing. Republicans joined Democrats in grabbing your money to build computer chip factories.
We will enable advanced semiconductor manufacturing to make a comeback here in America.
Democrats bragged about adding strings.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
The CHIPS Act contains 19 sections aimed at helping minority groups.
You already have a talent problem. Now you're looking at only being able to recruit from a very small minority of individuals. Then you have to do climate pledges. Then you have to hire from unions.
But diversity is good. And there has been horrible discrimination in this country.
That doesn't mean that you should shift the pendulum back to hire someone because of their race or their skin color if they're a diverse candidate.
Despite the billions you spent, most chips are still made in Taiwan. And even when we pay their chip makers, they struggle to build in America.
A major Taiwanese chip manufacturing plant will be delayed again.
If our government wants chips made in America, they should get out of the way. Micromanaging microchips just slows things down.
All right, John Stossel with a libertarian perspective. Here's an essay that had a profound effect on my life. It was by Meir Soloveichik in Commentary Magazine, Why Beards? So near the beginning, he talks about a Talmudic rabbi, Rabban Gamliel, who was the religious head of post-temple, meaning Jews 1900 years ago, and he was relieved of his position as the Nazi, as the head, because he was heavy-handed with his authority, and so they chose someone to replace him, Elazar ben Azariah, who was brilliant, but he had a flaw. He was only 18, and he didn't yet have a beard. Fortunately, according to the Talmud, there was a miracle overnight. Elazar awoke to find himself the owner of a long white beard. So the Jewish penchant for beards is a cultural marker that goes all the way back to the Bible. In the book of Chronicles, we read of an insult visited upon a group of King David's servants who had been sent to comfort the Ammonite king on the death of his father, suspecting the delegation of having come on a mission of espionage. Right? The king took David's servants and shaved them. And the king said, "Stay at Jericho until your beards are grown and then return." So this ancient Jewish horror of barefacedness, not having a beard was not merely cultural, it's intimately connected with the religious commandment, do not cut the edges of your beard. Right? That's a commandment from the Pentateuch, the Torah. The edges of your beard you shall not destroy. The ban was considered by the rabbis to be among the 365 prohibitions in the Torah. Breaking it is as serious a sin as the consumption of pork, and it has remained so ever since. Why? And why do many devout Jews today go beardless? So many traditional Jewish men have used an ancient Jewish exception. So in forbidding shaving, the biblical text employs two different verbs, not to cut the beard and not to destroy it. So to reconcile this ambiguity, the Talmud argues that the one truly forbidden action is using a razor, because that both shears the facial hair and thoroughly removes it. But alternative approaches such as trimming, cutting but not destroying, or using tweezers or kosher electric shavers, they are okay. So many yeshiva students use these rulings to be essentially barefaced. So electric shavers, usually approved by the rabbis, and they are approved because they do not actually destroy. So the spirit of the law, if not the letter, is clear. Jewish men should have beards. So why? Now, the practice of shaving first makes its appearance in the Bible in connection with the story of Joseph. And before Joseph goes in to see the Pharaoh, he was shaved and his clothing was changed, and then he was brought into the Pharaoh. So in Egypt, when you appear in royal society, you want to do that in a barefaced state. So the custom among men in Egypt was to shave. And foreigners can be distinguished from the native Egyptians because they may have full beards. So why were the Egyptians so ardent about removing the beard? So the defining cultural feature of ancient Egypt was its obsession with achieving immortality. And so when you have a beard, right, it turns gray fairly early on, and you can't pretend that you're as young as you might look with a clean-shaven appearance. So Egypt wanted to reject aging, wanted to deny death, and shaving the face was the key element in this Egyptian rejection of death. So no shaggy outlines or blemishes mar the perfectly smooth look. What appears to be the unveiling of the human face is a veiling of age and disorder. So the Hebrew Bible sets itself against pagan practices of every kind. And so the Hebrew Bible commands the opposite practice, essentially the wearing of beards, thus visibly and deliberately repudiating the false blessing of eternal youth and underscoring the fact of our mortality. So the very Hebrew word for beard, zakan, shares a root with zaken, an elderly person. So in Christian life, they often enforced shaving. So there was a desire among Christians to differentiate themselves from bearded Jews and bearded Muslims. And also Christians saw the beard as associated with ordinary human carnality. So you have a Christian scholar arguing that the cutting of the beard denotes that we ought to cut away the vices and sins which are a superfluous growth in us. Hence, we shave our beards that we may seem purified by innocence and humility, and that we may be like the angels who remain always in the bloom of youth. So Judaism has always found religious value in facial hair because Jews are not expected to embody angelic innocence. So by forbidding Jews to destroy their hair, the Bible warns them away from seeking the siren song of eternal youth. By encouraging Jews to grow beards, it reminds them that they will not be young forever. They must prepare the ground for those who come after them, just as their fathers did for them. And by acknowledging their mortality, Jews are instructed to eschew aspiring to the condition of disembodied angels. So for Judaism, it is not the young or the celibate who are most worthy of being revered. It is those who have already raised children and those who are blessed with grandchildren. So out of the three biblical patriarchs, only Jacob is referred to in the Midrash as the old one. Because it was Jacob who truly created the Jewish people and embodied the principle of its continuity. By leaping over the gulf of the generations, he gathered his son Joseph's two children to himself, and he took glory in his grandkids. So old age has considerable authority in many traditional cultures, including Orthodox Judaism. And physical manifestations of age are the indispensable substance from which we weave the moral fabric of society. So we have a Talmudic story, a midrash, saying that until Abraham, there was no old age. But when Abraham came, he pled for old age, saying, God, you must make a visible distinction between father and son, between a youth and an old man, so that the old man may be honored by the youth. God replied, I will begin with you. Abraham went off, and when he arose in the morning, he had a beard that had turned white. So today, in American culture, we tend to celebrate youth. And signs of aging are generally to be avoided at all costs in American culture. Youth is worshipped, immortality is sought, not in children, but in Botox. Our infatuation with youth is deeply embedded in our culture. So Joseph Epstein has written about our perpetual adolescence, and he notes that even baseball games used to be attended by adults dressed in a suit and a fedora or other serious adult hat. Now informality is being institutionalized to the point where captains of industry dress like children. If it was once assumed that life had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that the middle, adulthood, was the lengthiest and most earnest part where everything serious happened and much was at stake, the ideal everywhere today is to seem young for as long as possible. So according to the Talmud, a Jewish male becomes an adult at age 13 and a female at 12. And it used to be the notion of a 13-year-old as an adult seemed perfectly sensible. When we expected new teenagers to find a job, to learn a trade, to prepare to leave home, to take care of his own parents if needed, and start a family of his own. So the Depression generation in particular was required to mature very quickly. Now, today, the idea of a 12 or 13-year-old as an adult seems ludicrous. So Jews in America have reaped the benefits of America's affluence and extended youth. But there is a curse to it, and nowhere is this more evident than at an Orthodox wedding. So typically such events are lavish and expensively catered affairs, but inevitably there comes a moment when the groom and his extended family, followed by the bride's family and the bride, proceed down the aisle, and the crowd, having remained seated, as grandparents in their 70s or 80s walk haltingly to their places, suddenly the crowd rises up reverently before the young couple, beautiful and handsome, young and radiant. Now, standing up for the bride and groom is not required by Jewish law. Standing for the elderly at any time and at any place is a biblical injunction. Right, the same chapter of Leviticus that instructs male Jews to grow a beard insists that we rise before the age and glorify the face of an elder. Now, the author of this essay does not have a beard, but I'm hoping that I've internalized the lesson embodied by the Jewish penchant for beards. I hope that I will have the strength to resist the sundry temptations of our benign American Egypt, embrace the path of Abraham, the man chosen by God to found a family that from generation to generation would communicate to the world the principles of justice and righteousness. And I hope I will remember the admonition that there is no quicker route to senility than through the all-consuming and utterly futile effort to stay young forever. I like it. All right, here's a little bit from Amy Wax.
Professor of law and second-time guest on The American Mind. Amy, welcome back.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
We're very glad to have you. The occasion for this discussion is that you had a bone to pick with us a couple of weeks ago when Trump won, and we were talking about first 100 days of the administration. What should the priorities be? We mentioned a bunch of things. I think I talked a lot about culture and some of the sort of more soft power aspects of the first Trump administration. But you wrote in quite rightly and said, nobody, not Mike, not Ryan, not Spencer, nobody mentioned the Department of Education, which needs a total systems overhaul. Would you like to introduce this proposal to us just to start off with? Where are we at with the Department of Education and what needs doing?
Right. Well, a bone to pick is a little strong. I'm a great fan of your podcast. And I generally agree with so much of it. But in this one case, what should be the first 100-day priorities? I thought, oh, it's so typical that this incredibly vital issue is not being highlighted. And why is it an incredibly vital issue? I really just want to start with that. I don't think the Republican Party and the conservative movement in any of its forms has any future if we don't radically overhaul the education system. And here I am talking about K through 12 on up through higher ed, graduate education, professional education, every aspect of the university system. And why do I say that? Because what is going on right now is that impressionable young minds are being hammered by a far left identity obsessed social justice ideology under the guise of education. And that is happening. Well, is it happening everywhere 24/7? Not quite, but it is certainly happening in a lot of places, and people aren't even really aware of it. Right. So why does this matter? Eric Kaufman, the British sociologist, has shown that students that are exposed to critical race theory, to gender fluidity ideology, to negative commentary on our history, on our founding, and all this kind of woke stuff that, we're inherently ineradicably racist. I could go on and on. The standard issue woke ideology, they are swayed, they are influenced in their own thinking. And there's evidence for that. And they also become much more down on First Amendment rights. They are in censorship, cancellation, and all of that bad stuff. So it really does matter. Now, I recognize that with Trump's election, we have a bit of a rebellion by young men. Men have moved right, and it's mostly working class men. That is gratifying, but that still doesn't solve the problem. Which is that young people are much more woke than older people. That's been measured and that's been verified. So really, this is something that has to be addressed and reversed. So I call my little shtick here radical reactionary. Why is that? Well, the radical part. I think that drastic action is in order. I think we need some really zealous proponents of it in order to get this stuff done, because it really is going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, and there is going to be tremendous resistance. Why do I call it reactionary? Because we don't have to reinvent the wheel here, Spencer. We have a guide to what education should look like, and that guide is the past. We only need to look back. And I specifically recommend that we look back to my hometown, Troy, New York, upstate New York, where I started kindergarten in 1957 and graduated from high school in 1971. So I was educated mostly in the 60s. And of course, it was upstate New York. It was a backwater. The 60s hadn't really arrived. Our model of education was really something out of the past. So what was that model? First of all, what were the main ideas that motivated the model? Well, the most important one, there were two, actually. One is that adults and children are radically different, right? Adults are the ones in authority. Children really are not equipped to make the kinds of decisions and judgments that we now delegate to them, to exercise their autonomy or choices of what to learn, think, and do, right? And people just accepted that. The second was that they thought about the schools as having a much more restricted ambit of authority than they do now in terms of what they taught, what they covered, what sorts of subjects were addressed, the role of teachers. They delegated to parents a far greater degree of authority in many areas. So much smaller footprint, much more modest footprint here, right? The third thing is the goals of K through 12 were.
So anyway, getting back to that Mayor Soloveitchik essay, I read it in 2008 when it came out, and I didn't shave again for 3 years. Right. So I read that essay. I wanted a new start to my life. I'd abandoned writing on the pornography industry for a living a few months previous. And so no more shaving for approximately the next 3 years. My beard got, I don't know, about 15 inches long over that time. And it was a good way to demarcate the end of one stage of my life, launch into the other stage of my life. Then as I was coming towards the end of so this was like February of 2008, I think. That's when I stopped shaving. And then I graduated from Alexander Technique training school. I began there in January of 2009. I graduated in December of 2011, and I was launching my Alexander Technique practice, and I needed to borrow money. And part of the price of borrowing money, in hopes that I'd have a successful Alexander Technique practice, I committed to shaving off my beard. And when I shaved it off, my head just felt so much lighter. Right? It was heavy. It was itchy for the first few months. That was the toughest thing about having a beard. But then it was just damn heavy. And yeah, it took a little bit more effort to think up with my head, have my best posture and best use when I had this long beard. So most men in my family have not been able to grow beards. So growing a beard is pretty rare in Australia, pretty rare in the America I know. Not many friends of mine had beards, but it was a fun stage. I mean, a lot of people thought I looked homeless. It certainly made me look my age. So without a beard, I look much younger than my 58 years. So I could no longer indulge in youth culture when I had that beard. It gave me more gravitas. It intimidated people. Right? It made me feel more masculine. People reacted to me as though I were more masculine. I felt more masculine to my core. I felt distinctive. I felt perhaps more deeply attached to the Jewish tradition and to the traditional Jewish way of life. I liked it. Right? I liked having a beard. I liked what it did for me in connecting me with Yiddishkeit, connecting me with masculinity, connecting with me with my true age. And I was also glad to be rid of it. So both the beard and not beard